Good morning, and can I welcome everybody to the 8th meeting of the Education and Culture Committee in 2014. Can I remind everybody present that all electronic devices should be switched off because they do interfere with the sound system, so if you would do that, I'd be most grateful. Moving on to our first item on the agenda this morning is to receive a briefing on the Teachers Superannuation Scotland Amendment Regulations 2014. And can I welcome to the committee Michael Russell, who is the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Lifelong Learning, Chris Graham from the People and Leadership Unit in the Scottish Government, and Chad Dawtry from the Scottish Public Pensions Agency. Can I remind everyone present that this briefing provides an opportunity for members to hear from the Cabinet Secretary and his officials about the SSI. The debate on the motion for annulment will be held afterwards as a separate item, and of course during that only MSPs can take part in that particular debate. Can I invite the Cabinet Secretary therefore to begin and provide us with some opening remarks on the SSI?
Thank you, Convener. And, I appeared before this committee almost exactly a year ago in respect of a similar SSI and a similar motion. At that time I declared an interest at the opening. I will do so again. I referred to my wife at that stage as a prospective pensioner. She was not entirely happy with that reference, so I will try not to respeak it. But she is a teacher and contributing to the Scottish Public Pensions Agency. I'm no more pleased to appear before this committee on this issue than I was last year. I am always pleased to appear before the committee, but on this matter, I don't speak in support of these regulations with any great enthusiasm. Unfortunately, however, they are once again necessary. I want to reiterate the Government's commitment to public service pensions that are affordable, sustainable and fair, both for public servants and for the communities they serve. And I want to put on record again our recognition of the hard work and the considerable achievements of the teachers and lecturers who deliver high-quality education to children and young people across Scotland. The general context, the Westminster context of wage restraint and financial hardship in which we've had to apply previous increases to teachers' pension contributions, alas, still exists. Despite that, the UK Government continues to force us to make further increases. They are able to do so because of the current constitutional arrangements, under which the Government in Westminster sets the basic terms for the pensions of most of the people who provide public services in Scotland. Her Majesty's Treasury is still determined to raise more than £250 million of extra revenue a year from the pension contributions of teachers, police officers, firefighters and NHS staff in Scotland. The UK Government would still impose its punitive financial penalties on Scotland if we did not deliver this additional income. They give us a simple but an unwelcome choice: force public servants to pay yet higher pension contributions, or have less money to pay for the public services across Scotland which they deliver. We are in a slightly, and it's only a slightly better position this year, in that the level of increase required by the Treasury is only half of that required in each of the previous 2 years. That means they are only threatening to reduce the Scottish budget by around £50 million per annum in perpetuity if we do not meet their demands. That's a very small mercy for which to be grateful. The illustration I gave to the committee last year is still revealing. More than a third of that £50 million reduction would be attributable to teachers' pensions, almost £18 million. That is the equivalent of something just under 500 teachers. The reality is, therefore, that we cannot impose such a burden on Scottish education and Scottish communities. We have no choice but to implement employee pension contributions increases in the public sector for a third year, from April 2014. And that is why we've reluctantly brought forward the regulations which the committee is considering this morning. As in previous years, we are seeking to apply the increases fairly by asking those who earn more to bear a greater proportion of the burden. This is consistent with our approach in previous years, and as in previous years, mirrors the distribution of increases in England and Wales. That is, I think, all I need to say by way of introduction, Convener, but I do stress it is with no little reluctance that I commend these regulations to the committee.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. If members would indicate if they have any questions they wish to ask. Can I just begin with a slightly technical question which was raised by the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee, which was about the delay in laying the regulations. Could you just clarify for the committee what happened there?
Can I ask Mr Dawtry to do that? I think there's an explanation.
Yes, there was a regrettable delay between the signing of the regulations down south by Her Majesty's Treasury Commissioners and Treasury telling the Scottish Government that the regulations were ready to be laid. And I believe that my colleagues in the Legal Directorate made that clear to the committee and offered our apologies.
Thank you very much for that. I just wanted to clear that up. Can I call Neil Bibby?
Thanks, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, you said you were no more pleased to put forward the regulations today. Can I ask, how has the Scottish Government engaged with the UK Government to remove this increase or mitigate the amount of increase?
Well, as I replied to your colleague Mr Finlay last year, there has been regular engagement, there has been intensive engagement. I don't think it's any secret that we don't want to do this, and the answer has been the same. The answer is you either implement this or you get the money cut. And that's not going to change no matter how often you ask the questions. The reality is that is their position. They have not shifted from that position. They show no willingness to shift from that position.
Also, ask you, why does the Scottish Government put forward proposals to pass on the UK Government cuts to teacher conditions? You've found money for the white paper, discretionary housing payments. Why can you not find additional money for teacher pension contributions?
Well, those are two different things, of course, and discretionary housing payments is a very interesting point for you to raise, Mr Bibby. Essentially, that is mitigating decisions taken by Westminster, and were we not to do this, we'd be mitigating another decision taken by Westminster. And you cannot go on doing that forever, particularly in perpetuity, because the £18 million this year would not be a one-off, it would be forever. So that would be 470-something teachers, I think, forever that would require to be paid for out of this. That's clearly not feasible. Of course, there is a solution, and the solution is to have all the fiscal powers available to the Scottish Parliament.
Mary Scanlon.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary, unlike your wife, I am a pensioner, so I declare an interest.
I am surprised by that information.
I thought you would be, and I would refer members to my register of interests. I was looking back for some information on pensions in Scotland. The last Audit Scotland report was February 2011, so I appreciate my figures are a bit out of date. However, at that time, the Auditor General looked at local government, NHS, teachers, civil service, police and firefighters. Obviously, local government is funded. I appreciate there are differences between the schemes. But at that time, the pension scheme that was most in the red was the teachers, £240 million in the red. And there were 59,000 dependents, 27,000 deferred, and 78,000 people paying in. So given that it was 240 million in the red that year, how could that continue with the level of contributions in order to be affordable, sustainable and fair? And where does this burden fall if it doesn't fall on employers and employees' contributions?
Would Mr Dawtry like to talk about the technical nature of the schemes? I think that would be helpful if that happened, and then I'm happy to pick up any political point.
It's also worth pointing out that there are more up-to-date figures in the public domain. The Scottish Government published a paper on the 23rd of September, Pensions in Independent Scotland, and that gave figures for all of the schemes, including smaller NDPP schemes from the end of March 2012. As far as the figures you're referring to are concerned, it's an understandable position to take that there's a cash flow difference between the money that comes in and the money that's paid out. But it's also important to remember the money that's paid out is effectively paid out to today's pensioners, which is related to yesterday's pension promises. So they have already paid into the scheme and their pensions are being paid out, whereas today's contributions are actually on behalf of current active members of the scheme for future pensions, so it's not always a fair comparison to take. You're comparing almost two different generations of public sector pension scheme members.
Well, given that my, if you don't mind, given that my figures are so out of date, and I'm Deputy Convener of the Audit Committee, so I just had this in my office, if it was 240 million in the red, in February 2011, can you tell me what's the state of finances in the scheme in September 2013? Is it still in the red or in the black?
On that measure of cash flow for money in versus the money that's being paid out in pensions, and bearing in mind the point I've just made that the two are not really connected, it is still in that position, yes. It's in an annual cash flow deficit. But the important facts about a pension scheme are the ones that are given in actuarial valuations of the scheme, which look at the life of the scheme over the next 40 to 60 years, which is the period over which the liabilities that are built up. are defrayed and the contributions for those liabilities are made.
Well, I'm actually comparing it to the other schemes that the Auditor General examined at that time. And the other schemes, obviously, local government, 266 million surplus, NHS 222, civil service in the red 38 million, police and fire, it's actually at zero, but that was in the worst state on the books at that time. So what I'm really saying is, compared to the other public sector pension schemes, the education, the teacher scheme has been highlighted by the Auditor General as an issue. Would you say that it fares worse in terms of affordability, sustainability in the long term than the other pension schemes the Auditor General's compared it with?
No, I wouldn't. I think on that kind of more narrow measure of cash flow, it does. But a number of public sector schemes are in deficit. And you'll be aware that there's been a programme of reform which has looked at public sector schemes, but I wouldn't say that the teacher scheme is necessarily faring any worse in terms of sustainability and affordability in the long term than any other.
I'm slightly concerned, and it's only my third week on the committee, but I do understand the contribution rates changed into a tiered system April to March 2013 and then again. And so I'm surprised, given that there has been an increase in the contributions, that we're still almost $250,000 in the red on a cash flow basis. Can you confirm that's the case?
I understand, but effectively, if the pension scheme were to be closed today and no more contributions were made, the pensions that are being paid today would still have to be paid. You would have a bigger deficit.
Yes.
The point I'm trying to make is that it's not really it's not the perfect measure of deciding on whether a scheme is actually affordable and sustainable.
No. I'm only going by the Auditor General. The payout is 756 million, and the total contributions in a year is 516. So the 240 million has to be met from general taxation revenue. Is that correct?
That's correct.
That's
yes.
correct. So every year, the taxpayer is, in order to fund the teachers' pension scheme, unlike other pension schemes, the taxpayers are having to find £240 million.
Every year the government is having to honour promises that were made previously, and there's an imbalance.
And that $250,000 is being taken from other budgets.
It's been taken from the Scottish budget.
Thank you.
And this motion is asking us to do more, essentially. And
Yes.
last year, if I remember correctly, your predecessor committee supported this motion. So I think there was a slight inconsistency in that position. I think what we're seeing here, however, is...
Excuse me, you don't know what I'm going
to do. Oh, well,
to
indeed, and I look forward with anticipation.
If I may say so.
I am now looking forward agog to see what you do in these matters. Yeah. As ever, I should say, Mrs. Scanlon, I'm always agog at what you're going to do next.
So unpredictable, am I?
Indeed, I just want to make it clear. This scheme, as it operates at the present moment, is an affordable scheme. The decisions made by the Treasury are to do with public expenditure cuts. They're not to do with a scheme that isn't affordable. I think even the Treasury will admit that that's the situation. So what we are talking about here is, if I may put it this way, an ideological approach to this matter that's coming from south of the border. And the pressure that upon us is whether or not to follow suit. The argument I am putting, regrettably, is that we have to follow suit because we're faced with a penalty otherwise. And I think that is the issue at stake.
Final question.
Well, very, very short one.
How can it be an affordable scheme when $240 million is being taken from other budgets in the Scottish Government in order to finance the essential payments?
There is an ongoing review and valuation, I think, that is due later this year. Yeah. And we would only be able to make the decision you're asking us to make.
I'm not asking you, I'm just looking for clarification.
We would only be able to make the decision which you are suggesting might make, and I'm still uncertain about what your position is then, but you would only be able to do that once we had a valuation of the scheme, and an actuarial valuation of the scheme over the long term, and we don't have that. So it wouldn't be possible to make those decisions.
Well, you were asked to make that in 2011, but there you are.
Jane Baxter.
Thanks, Convener. Morning. Cabinet Secretary, the EIS have described this increase in pension contributions as an austerity tax on hard-working teachers. What would you say to that union's membership in response?
Well, I would say that I advise them, first of all, to look at this document, Scotland's Future, about the future of Scotland and Scotland's independence. I would advise them to turn to page 138 and following and look at the positive proposals on pensions within this document, and then I would advise them to vote yes in the referendum, because then we don't have to come back and have this argument again.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Liam MacArthur.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. This may be following up Mary Scanlon's line of question, maybe one more for Mr Dawtry. You've explained rather helpfully the way in which that funding of pension schemes operate. But presumably the Auditor General, in setting out the concern, or setting out the figure, sorry, that he set out, would have been aware of that, and therefore, can you maybe advise whether any representations were made to the Auditor General at that stage that perhaps the way in which he was characterising the situation in relation to the pension scheme for teachers was perhaps unhelpful or potentially misleading?
What I can tell the committee is that we worked fairly closely with the Audit Scotland team that did the work on this, and would have raised reference to the cash flow position as not being the only or perfect measure of the sustainability or affordability of a pension scheme, yes.
But a measure of it, and I suppose the charge that's been laid at the door of successive governments is that, taking comfort from the notion that it's kind of I been thus, and that we can play catch up in due course, has led to a situation where pensions reform has been put off and put off. This is perhaps more a question for the Cabinet Secretary, but in a sense your explanation of where we are with that pension scheme would almost provide succour to those faced with a difficult decision about what to do with pensions, that one could get round to dealing with the shortfall that Mary Scanlon was identifying, the cash position, not the only measure I accept, but that could be kind of put off to another stage. Is that?
Well, I certainly think there's a need to discuss constructively and intensely the issue of pensions in Scotland. I think that is, in my view, a two-stage process. The first stage process is to get the power to run those schemes and to make the decisions on those schemes back to Scotland, and I think that's an important step. I think thereafter, I think the proposals in the White Paper on a commission on pensions, the way in which one would discuss the overall issue of public sector pensions is a good model to go on. It doesn't just apply to the question of how much is paid, it applies to the question of when it is paid. I think that the EIS, not to misrepresent their position, are also in favour, as am I, of maintaining the retirement age at 65. And I think most people in this committee with any knowledge of teaching would say that going to carrying on teaching to 67 is unacceptable. So I think that commission is an important step forward. But the first thing is to get the power to make decisions on these pension schemes back to Scotland, and we don't have that power at the moment, or rather the power we have is so circumscribed by the financing and by the Treasury that it's not really a power at all.
But is that not the problem with the advice that you've just provided to Jane Baxter, that teachers should look at the White Paper, see what's set out there, but from page 123 onwards, what they will find is a lot of promises, but absolutely no calculation of the cost, or indeed what the other compromises would have to be made to deliver something of greater value or more beneficial to teachers. Is that not the case? Of course,
the White Paper is rich in information, as you are aware, and
not so much figures.
There's very substantial financial information in the second section that looks at the balance sheet. But the pages 138 onwards are very clear about the need to take an overall view of public sector pensions, to make sure these decisions are made across the public sector. And I think that is the right next step. And this motion, helpfully from Mr Bibby today, allows us to focus on that, because it allows us to say to ourselves, what is the right way to move forward? And the right way to move forward is to make sure that these schemes are run, the scheme is run in Scotland, the decisions are made in Scotland, and that, therefore we can then integrate the thinking on pensions across the public sector. I think that's a very positive thing to do.
One final question. I think that may be a fair assessment, but as you've already indicated in your own words, your desire to spend more in this area will constrain the amount you're able to spend in another area, and that is something that the White Paper I think rather unhelpfully glosses over. So being, I think, a bit more upfront about where the additional funds would come from in order to secure a more generous settlement for teachers or other public sector workers.
I think the phrase
is sadly lacking.
I think the word generous is an unfortunate one to apply to, for example, continuing to retire at 65. I think that's not generous. I think that's eminently sensible. But I would, there's a lot of cross-referencing in the White Paper, and page 77 and following is headed Early Priorities for Action Within Sound Public Finances. And there's a very considerable analysis in that section about how you achieve sound public finances. On pensions, we've got to remember that the greatest threat to pensions in the last decade started with Gordon Brown's stealth attack on pension and has continued with essentially an attack on particularly public sector pensions south of the border. So actually, the prospects for public and private sector pensions in Scotland are immeasurably better in a country that's actually focused on taking this forward with the Commission.
Supplementary on that from Neil Bibby.
Just given that you raised the prospect of independence in the White Paper, can I ask you, given that the Teachers' Pension Fund is a notional fund, contributions are paid indirectly to Her Majesty's Government and underwritten by them, how, with a much smaller number of contributors, can we be sure teachers' pensions will have the same degree of protection in an independent Scotland?
Well, the much smaller number of contributors is matched exactly to the number of people who are taking the pension. This is a smaller number of people drawing out because this is a Scottish scheme, and it's a smaller number of people paying in. I think that's axiomatic. But I would commend to you, Mr Bibby, the White Paper on page 138 and following. I think this does give you a good analysis of why public sector pensions need to be seen in the round, and we need to discuss a lot of the issues. Now, you've chosen today to bring this motion for annulment. I entirely understand why you've done so, and I say it's with great reluctance that we wish to take this forward because it is demanded of us by a Treasury that's not listening. But we should also, in so doing, say, is there a different way of doing this? Is there a better way of doing this? And the answer is yes. The way is to control the finances in Scotland to apply those. I don't know whether perhaps you could enlighten us, whether the proposals that Labour is announcing today include the pension schemes being run from Scotland. That would be an interesting issue. Because if it does include that in terms of the money that's coming directly to Scotland, then perhaps that's a small step forward. But it would be better to see it across the board and to say how we could do this better for ourselves.
And final question from Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I should declare an interest before I start, as I am married to a retired teacher who is also a former NESUWT rep. Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned the £18 million in perpetuity that this would cost were we to mitigate what the EIS, I think, if I get the quote correct, is a Westminster austerity tax. It seems to me that even if we were to take that decision today, it would be extremely unfair on the rest of the public sector workers who will also be affected at that, are also our hard-working fire, police, nurses, the NHS staff and civil servants. So could you just give us more detail about what the impact on the public sector as a whole would be should we have to mitigate this tax?
Well, if the committee remembers, I'm sure it does, last year at this time there was a similar motion to annul from Mr Finlay. At that time, of course, contribution was greater, so that would have been about a third of the £100 million cost at that stage, which would have been about £34 million. Now, that would have been perpetuity too. So if that had succeeded last year, and then we were back here doing it again, we're then up to £52 million, roughly, just over £50 million. That's a very considerable number of teachers that we're talking about. But yes, there is a knock-on effect, because it would be quite inequitable if this decision were to be reached for teachers and we were not to reach it for other parts of public sector. So the cost in total would be, if last year had been 100 million, this year to be 50 million. Now, that's 150 million pounds. That, we're never done hearing Labour telling us how we should spend money. But in actual fact, to spend money in that way would have, perforce, because of the nature of the Scottish budget, the unrealistic nature of the Scottish budget, the nature of the Scottish budget that needs to be changed and is anticipated, the change is anticipated in Scotland's future, then we would have to cope with that, and I don't think that could be done.
Okay, thank you. We are going to move now on to agenda item 2. And as I indicated earlier, we will now debate the motion calling for the Teachers Superannuation Scotland Amendment Regulations 2014 to be annulled. Can I remind everyone present that only MSPs may participate in the debate and that it may, but doesn't have to last up to 90 minutes. Can I first invite Neil Bibby to move and speak to motion S4M 9312? Mr Bibby.
90 minutes, is that 45 minutes each way? I don't know.
No, I'd rather not.
We'll see. I welcome the opportunity to speak to my motion. As committee members will be aware, my colleague Neil Finlay moved a motion similar to this last year, and it's for the same reasons I do the same today. Teachers, like many other public sector workers, have seen their wages squeezed, been subjected to the cost of living crisis and put under increasing pressure from cuts which are overstretching vital public services such as school education. For 2 years, teachers have seen their pay frozen and are now finally seeing a 1% rise. This is long overdue, but what will concern many teachers is that, again this year, they are set to pay for an increase in pension contributions yet again. This, in effect, means there is no 1% pay rise at all for teachers, as they are being given that rise in one hand and money is taken out the other hand to pay for an increase in pension contributions. In last year's discussion, the Cabinet Secretary said at a time of wage restraint and financial hardship, it is wrong to ask such public employees to pay for more for their pensions in this way. I agree with the Cabinet Secretary. The question is, therefore, why are Scottish teachers being asked for something that is wrong yet again? The General Secretary of the EIS has described the latest increase as an austerity tax on hard-working teachers. As members will be aware, the EIS has welcomed my motion today. They state that the third increase in 3 years will increase the average pension contribution deducted from teachers' pay to 9.6% of their salary. This means the amount deducted from teachers' pay will have increased by 50% since April 2012, from 6.4% of pay to 9.6% of pay for the average teacher. For classroom teachers on the main grade pay scale, 3 years of increases will mean they will be paying over £1,000 more per year in pension contributions. The EIS have also said the objective of the coalition government was not to protect the low-paid or to minimise opt-outs, it was to raise revenue. The Scottish Government has accepted that objective. The Scottish Government have also decided to pass on the increases in the same tiered way as the coalition government. The EIS have also expressed concerns that teachers progressing by increments throughout the main grade scale should have been protected. This was an issue raised last year, supported by hundreds of emails from teachers, and which was ignored by the Scottish Government. The SSTA also conducted a survey of members in October 2013. Over half expressed concern about their likely financial situation post-retirement, and almost half said they were ready to take industrial action to protect their pensions. Teachers are working flat out and under a great deal of pressure to prepare children for new exams and implement new hires. They deserve far more support and recognition they are getting. They deserve far better from the Scottish Government, who are simply passing on a Tory teacher tax.
Thank you. Call other members wish to. Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Convener. Just following up the line of questioning there, I see from the papers that we have here that the decisions taken by the Scottish Government under this order are simply being laid at the door of the UK Government, everything from the delay in laying the order through to the detail of the order itself. But I think, as the Cabinet Secretary rather persuasively put it, if we spend more money in one area, we have less to spend in other areas, and simply telling us and telling teachers that it would all be very different in an independent Scotland, I don't think is persuasive or satisfactory. I think any government would still be faced with the same challenges, that if you spend more in one area, you have less to spend in another area, and therefore, while the Cabinet Secretary has made much of his reluctance in bringing forward this order, it doesn't appear to me, as Neil Bibby has already indicated, that there has been a great deal done to try and adopt and adapt an approach in Scotland that is very much different at all, despite, I think, as we heard last year, concerns about the structure of teaching in Scotland being different and perhaps meriting more focus on that. And therefore, I think, while I am prepared to support the statutory instrument before us, I think pretending that somehow all this would be so much different where the rules of the game changed, I just don't think is credible. Thank you.
Colin Beattie.
I think the key point here that certainly in Mr Bibby's motion wasn't touched on is the sheer cost of this. where is the money coming from? Which services are going to be cut to be able to afford to implement this? I think it's been a recurrent theme with Labour motions and so forth, that they never seem to give the detail of where the money is coming from, and I think this is just another case of this. £50 million, a lot of money on our budget. Where would it come from? Nobody wants to do this. Nobody wants to increase pension payments for teachers. They are hard-working. They do have a huge contribution, but at the end of the day, we don't have a choice. I just don't see we have a choice.
Jane Baxter.
Thank you, Convener. I'm pleased to support Neil Bibby's motion to annul the instrument before us. We have opposed this pension contribution before and we oppose it again. The long-standing concerns from the teachers' unions have highlighted the impact these increased payments would have on deductions from teachers' salaries. As we've heard, the increases which have been implemented over the past 3 years have amounted to more than £1,000 per year in pension contributions from teachers' salaries. I'm sure many teachers see this as a pay cut rather than public sector pay restraint. The EIS have welcomed the motion lodged by my colleague before us today, and they've highlighted there are still significant challenges facing teachers and their incomes. I hope that the Cabinet Secretary will engage with them and the other teaching unions in Scotland on the issue of teachers' pay. I support the motion.
Mary Scanlon.
I think, like others, I know exactly how hard teachers work, and I give credit to each and every one of them with all the changes they face and to do so well. I just have two questions, Convener. And the first one, I apologise again for going back to 2011. But at that time, there was a recommendation from the Auditor General to the Scottish Government excuse me, to provide a clear statement of the aims and objectives of public pension schemes in Scotland, and to consider whether differences among schemes in areas such as contribution rates and level of benefits are necessary to realise the objectives of the scheme. So my first question, Convener, is... my first point here, and maybe, is what was done in 2011. And my second one is to Neil, and probably similar to the previous questions. We've heard this morning that there is a deficit of 240 million. And despite the increased contributions we've seen in recent years, we still have a deficit around £250,000 and money being taken from other budgets in order to fund that. So in this summing up, I would ask Neil, where that money will come from, and if, this pension scheme is indeed affordable, sustainable in the long run, and if it is fair to both the contributors and the pensioners and the taxpayers.
Thank you very much. Call George Adam.
Thank you, Convener. Basically, Mr Bibby came away with a wee cheeky bit of alliteration there, Tory teacher tax. Now, that's part of the problem with this debate coming from the opposition parties, is the fact that they're just coming away with wee cheeky lines like that, but no substance, no actual substance in what they're actually offering here, just asking for more money, the begging bowl mentality once again, just trying to get more money, but without actually saying where they'll get it from. And I think in the real world, in reality, the situation is exactly as the Cabinet Secretary has already said, is the fact that this is the choice that we have now in the future, is between the two futures, independence or continually sitting here with a Westminster government that is dictating to what this Parliament should be doing. Now, I think that is the actual real debate we're having here, and this is the important part. And I think we need to move away, because we're dealing with people's lives and teachers' lives here, and I think it's quite degrading of Mr Bibby to just use a wee cheeky throwaway line like Tory teacher tax. That's glib, it's smug, it's not really what we need in this level of debate. And I think this is the reality of the situation, is that we have the choice of the two futures. And this is a perfect example why Scotland needs to vote yes on September 18th.
Thank you very much. Before I call the Cabinet Secretary, I think I'm probably about to repeat what I said last year, but I think Mr Bibby makes a fair point in terms of the situation with regard to teachers. I think we all agree that teachers are hard-working. None of us wish to be here in the situation that we find ourselves in, and I think that's all committee members would agree with that. But I think, unless Mr Bibby, unlike Mr Finlay last year, who couldn't answer this question, unless he can answer this question, then I think his motion effectively falls at that stage. You have to provide, Mr Bibby, I think, a detailed answer as to where the money is coming from. I think Cabinet Secretary said 18 million this year, roughly speaking. If that's the amount of money that's coming out, that would have to be filled just for teachers, and I think it's also fair to say you couldn't just do it for one part of the public sector, you would have to do it for all the public sector. You have to give us detailed responses to which part of the budget that money would come from, because we cannot have a hole created in the budget without you saying where the money would come from. If you can do both sides of the equation, then we'll have a discussion. Unless you can do that, I think, frankly, your motion has no merit.
Can you very briefly, I should have declared an interest earlier on, like Mary and Claire. I have a sister who's currently a teacher and a mother who was formerly a head teacher and almost certainly benefited from the scheme. I should have done that earlier, sorry.
Okay, thank you, Mr MacArthur. Can I call the Cabinet Secretary?
Thank you very much. I mean, I want to start by saying I agree with Mr Bibby on substantially on almost everything he's said. I think that this is regrettable, and I think in the best of all possible worlds, which in my view, of course, and Mayor Scanlon and Liam MacArthur and Mr Bibby and Mr Baxter will not agree, but it would be an independent Scotland. That would be the best of all possible worlds, and we would not be having this debate. But unfortunately, I think his argument does fall at the very end, because it really belongs to the something must be done school of politics. It doesn't belong to the school of politics which says what should be done. And I think that is the real issue. I want to really commend Mary Scanlon's approach, because actually I do think that she is asking serious and important questions about pension provisions for the future of the Scottish pension scheme. And I make the offer to her that I'd be very happy to facilitate a meeting between herself and Mr Dawtry to look into the detail of the Scottish pensions, teachers' pension scheme. I do point out with her this is within the context of reserved policy on occupational pensions. We are really constrained on that. We're particularly constrained on the teachers' scheme because each time we have sought variation, and I'm happy to meet Mary Scanlon to talk about the variations we have sought, each time we've sought variation, we've not been able to achieve it. Even modest variation in negotiation, we've not been able to achieve. But I think you are, I think Mary Scanlon is asking good questions, and I think it is important to have that debate. And I think that debate, in my view, should go on after the powers of this scheme are repatriated to Scotland, to have a constructive debate about how we provide the best and most affordable pension scheme for Scotland's teachers. We have Jane Baxter sort of accused the Scottish Government of not engaging on the issue of teachers' pay. I think a negotiation that's lasted for the best part of 2 years, a detailed negotiation, shows a serious level of engagement from the Scottish Government. And the fact that we now have a settlement not just on the pay issue, but also on the issue of supply teaching and also on the issue of the McCormack report and its recommendations is very gratifying. And it is a tribute to the serious negotiations that have been undertaken by the teaching unions, as well as by the local authorities and the Scottish Government. So we have engaged on all these issues. The difficulty with the tiering that has been a subject around this table, the tiering of this, is it's not been possible to get an agreement amongst the unions themselves as to how the tiering should take place. I made that point last year, and I make that point again this year. We have sought to try and get an agreement amongst the unions on the tiering proposals. But in the end, we have settled for these tiering proposals as the fairest, we believe, and the ones that offered as much protection as we could find for new lower paid teachers. But we could have gone further if we had got an agreement amongst the teaching unions. I just want to say that in terms of Liam MacArthur's contribution, I do agree that it is sometimes a temptation for all of us to have simplistic solutions. And Mr MacArthur taxes me with having a simplistic view of this matter and simply saying if independence existed, things would be better. Well, that is a simple solution. And I also think it's the right solution. I have to say, because in here, in Scotland's Future, in this volume, are very considerable proposals to take the whole issue of public sector pensions a major step forward. And that's what we're required to do. That's why Mr Bibby's motion today is welcome, because we can look at this type of discussion where all of us are dissatisfied with the proposal we have. All of us are constrained by the decisions being made elsewhere. But we're splitting on how we would take it forward. We could unify on the way in which we could take forward better public sector, affordable and sustainable pensions in Scotland. And there's another major gain from independence. So, Convener, it's with no great enthusiasm, I have to say, that I feel that this motion must fail, Mr Bibby's motion must fail. I just hope we won't be back again in a future year, because we'll have the control of pensions here, and we'll be having the type of debate that Mary Scanlon is inviting us to have.
Cabinet Secretary, can I call Neil Bibby to wind up the debate and to indicate whether he is pressing the motion or if he seeks to withdraw it?
Thanks, Kevin. I have to say, I think SNP members are beginning to sound a bit like a broken record. Last year the claims were only if we had the power, and today it's the same. Let's leave aside the fact that promising Scandinavian levels of public investment and American levels of taxes is financial nonsense, and let's leave aside in the white paper the SNP's priorities for tax cuts isn't teachers but big business and also millionaires. The truth is, at the end of the day, the Cabinet Secretary has not made an argument for increasing teacher pension contributions, and SNP members today haven't made an argument for increasing teacher pension contributions. Mr Russell, you said you entirely understand the motion that I brought forward today. Colin Beattie has said nobody wants to do this. Therefore, move my motion to increase, motion not to increase teacher pension contributions and to pass on the Tory teacher tax.
Thank you very much. Can I therefore put the question that motion S4M 9312 be agreed to? Are we all agreed? We are not all agreed, therefore there will be a division. Therefore, could those members who wish to support the motion please show? Thank you. Those against? Thank you. The result of the division is that 2 members agreed and 7 did not agree. Therefore, the motion is defeated. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary and his officials for attending this morning, and I suspend the meeting briefly before we move on to the next item. Thank you. Our next item is to take evidence on the Historic Environment Scotland Bill. Can I welcome our first panel of witnesses, Ian Walford and Diana Murray, who are Joint Chief Executives of Historic Scotland and the Royal Commission on Ancient and Historical Monuments of Scotland. Can I thank you both for attending today? Both of you are most welcome to the committee. Can I also remind members that we are joined by two other members from outside the committee who have an interest in this bill. We have Liz Smith, MSP, and Patricia Ferguson, MSP, so welcome to you both as well. I'm going to invite questions from members, and can I say to the two members who are joining us today, I'm more than happy if you please indicate when you want to ask questions. It would be helpful if you asked your questions at the same point when it comes up, if an issue is coming up that you're interested in. So please indicate, but I will take members of the committee first, but I will bring you in as soon as I can. But I want to move straight to questions, and can I begin with Joan McAlpine?
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning. The main policy aim of the bill, as I understand it, is that Historic Environment Scotland will carry out all of the functions of Historic Scotland and RCAHMS, with the exception of strategic policy function, which will move to ministers. I wonder if you could outline for us in layman's terms what existing functions are being transferred to the new body.
All of the functions that we carry out at the moment, we're satisfied are accounted for in the bill as it stands at the moment. From the Commission's point of view, our main functions are to investigate and record the historic environment. We are essentially a research body, and we go out and find as much out about the historic environment as we can, which underpins the decisions that are made about heritage management. We also have a collection of 20 million items that will be taken forward and incorporated in the new body. And we have a responsibility for outreach and education, and that will be taken forward into the new body, particularly our work with communities around Scotland. If you want to.
And in terms of Historic Scotland, the various functions in different pieces of legislation that are carried out at the moment by Historic Scotland on behalf of ministers in terms of regulation, in terms of looking after the properties and the care of Scottish ministers will be put on the face of the legislation. But also importantly, and the government has been very clear that they want to protect and also enhance the functions of both organisations. Some of the functions which Historic Scotland has carried out over the years, which are not explicit in statute, more discretionary in terms of education, in terms of some of the conservation advice which is given across the country, and those will be encompassed as well in the new legislation. So the new organisation will be able to carry those out. So again, it is very much about creating a new body which the whole greater than the sum of the parts, and actually enhancing as well as protecting the functions of the two existing organisations.
As I understand it, some of the functions are being simplified and adjusted according to the policy memorandum. Could you perhaps illustrate how the functions are going to be simplified?
Well, one example there is in terms of the heritage management functions, which are currently carried out by Historic Scotland on behalf of ministers. And by putting the heritage management functions will be carried out by the new organisation, broadly as they are at the moment. But the important distinction and where the streamlining is possible is that because Historic Environment Scotland will be on the same sort of footing as SEPA, Scottish Natural Heritage, will be a separation between ministers setting the strategic direction and the functions carried out by specialists, that local authorities will, in one instance, will need to notify the new, will be consulting the new organisation on listed building consent applications rather than notifying, and that actually will streamline the process. It will take 28 days potentially out of the process. So that's one example where there will be an element of streamlining of the heritage management functions.
Okay. And the strategic policy function being transferred to the core of the Scottish Government, do you
I think that's a huge benefit, because one of the things that we've lacked in Scotland, indeed in the world, I suspect, and this will be a first, is a heritage strategy. And having the policy unit in Scottish Government means that we can mainstream the historic environment policy in line with general environmental policy, with placemaking, with all the other policies that government has. And that means that it takes a proper place. When it was in Historic Scotland, that was a very difficult thing to do. So I very much welcome that. I think it will be a much better arrangement.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Before I bring in Liam MacArthur, can I just say I should have said this at the start, just for the record purposes, that the committee did have an informal visit to RCAHMS offices and had previous discussions to help inform the scrutiny of the bill. So I just mentioned that for the record. Liam MacArthur.
Yeah, my thanks for that visit, which was, I think, exceptionally useful. In terms of streamlining the process, one of the issues that or concerns been raised with me since that visit is the possible future of the fines panel, which I think is felt to operate the fines panel for artefacts of archaeological value. That there's a fear that somehow the fines panel may not be continued under the merged body, and that the process may become internalised, a bit more bureaucratic, etc. And that the value that I think many people have found in being able to make approaches to the fines panel to have artefacts located for a period out with Edinburgh or whatever. Has been very beneficial. Is there anything you can say at this stage about the future of that specific aspect of the work?
I think this every intention of disposal panel will continue, and one of the aims of the new organisation is that it will be much more transparent than perhaps it has been in the past. So I really wouldn't expect that to happen. I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Okay. I have a small question, Patricia.
Yes, on the issue of simplification.
Well,
okay, thank you, Convener. I think, Mr Walford, you mentioned that in future local authorities would have a slightly different duty in terms of what they do about buildings or issues that they may have in the historic environment. Can you just explain what that difference actually will mean in practice?
In terms of the functions which will be transferred in the bill to Historic Environment Scotland, the role of local authorities will not particularly change. As a result of that, the new organisation will have that separation from ministers. That will be that one element of streamlining, which will put it on a par with other equivalent regulatory bodies. Actually, the role of local government in the consents process, the engagement with the new organisation, will not change particularly now. Obviously, we've consulted very closely with local government interests over the last 18 months, and that will continue. Actually, there's a group where the Scottish Government is leading with COSLA, with ourselves, a number of other stakeholders across the historic environment, looking very much beyond this bill, which obviously the bill is setting up the new organisation, so it won't particularly change the functions of local government, but looking what are the possibilities, the opportunities in the longer term of reforming that system of care and protection and regulation around the historic environment.
If I may, Convener, to follow that up, you mentioned, though, that local authorities would have a duty to consult but not to notify. So can you explain exactly what the differences are there and who ultimately will make the decision about a particular issue?
Well, in terms of if it's a listed building consent, so local, there's an application to change a listed building, again, it is the local authority as now which will make that decision. Now they will consult Historic Environment Scotland rather than notify them at the end of their internal processes. Say that, so the Historic Environment Scotland will then have an opportunity, if they feel that the proposal is not in line with policy, to object at that point, and obviously the local authority would then take that into account. And again, what would not change under the legislation is the local authority would then make that decision. They would take into account the views of Historic Environment Scotland. If they went against the objection of the organisation, then ministers as now would have the opportunity to call in that particular case for determination within the government.
Okay, thank you.
It's a very specific, small supplementary. Well, okay then, very quickly then.
Just to the exchange there with Patricia Ferguson, and it's been raised with me concerns about the way in which local authorities take on the role for designation and for scheduling for scheduled monuments, and there was a fear that there's a potential conflict there in those two roles, and that local authorities themselves aren't necessarily set up in order to manage that conflict. Is this an issue that you've had an opportunity to reflect on? Is this something that the body you referred to, working with COSLA, is likely to look at and try to find a way through it?
So just to be clear, in case I interrupted, the bill will not change again the powers of local government and this organisation in terms of actually designation of listed buildings and scheduled monuments. Again, that will move from ministers to the new organisation. So Historic Environment Scotland will be the organisation which will make decisions about whether to designate a building as listed or a scheduled ancient monument. So again, the relationship will be the same there. There will be that slight change in terms of listed building consent. But so again, in terms of the role of local government, obviously there was a lot. That was one of the issues during the consultation on the bill and on the strategy was, will there be additional functions or burdens that will pass to local government? Again, we're clear that that's not the case. But again, the ongoing work with COSLA is looking longer term at how the whole process potentially could be streamlined so that we get the better outcomes with less cost and less issues for developers and applicants and so on. So the bill itself will not make any change in that relationship.
Right. And that's helpful. There may be a perception issue that needs to be clarified.
No,
that's helpful.
Thank you for that, Liam. Neil Bibby.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask you about Minister's power of direction. What, in your opinion, why do the Scottish Government feel they need more powers of direction?
I think the Cabinet Secretary has been very clear that she doesn't want more powers of direction, but in fact would prefer this organisation in the future to be a non-departmental public body, which has fewer ministerial powers of direction in that regard. And the powers of direction in this bill are very similar to those in the National Library of Scotland bill. So I'm sorry, does that clarify what you mean?
No, I've maybe kind of misunderstood the. Can you tell me what powers are being moved from the individual bodies to Scottish Government ministers? What in that case? What powers are being moved?
There are no powers from the Royal Commission that are being moved to ministerial direction. Okay. The Royal Commission on Ancient Historical Monuments of Scotland is currently regarded as a non-departmental public body, and we are a charitable body. The ministerial direction is in the form of agreeing the corporate plan and the general policies of ministers, which obviously we are subject to just as any NDPB is. But there's no direction over exactly what is done on the curatorial side, for example. And indeed, there is an exemption for charitable status in the Charities Trustees Act, which, along with the other national collections of Scotland, we have exemption for that. As the bill as the draft bill as it stands doesn't alter that relationship with ministers, so the new organisation will have the same relationship as the Commission enjoys at the moment. The effect will be for Historic Scotland's functions.
Yeah. And just to add to that, ministers will, under the draft bill, as you've seen, have a general power of direction. As Diana said, will be required to approve the corporate plan. But again, just to be clear, some of the discussion just now about regulatory decisions, about curatorial decisions, what we do with individual properties that are looked after by the new organisation, items in our collections. There will not be any power of direction for ministers. And again, that's one of the kind of tenets of this bill, is that it's setting ministers will be setting the general strategy. of the organisation, but the individual decisions about regulation, about curatorial matters will be carried out by specialists within the organisation. And just again, actually, just one point on the, in a sense, a safeguard on that is that while the new organisation, for example, will make the decisions about designation, so if there's an application to list a building or schedule a monument, that will be a decision that will be made by the new organisation, but it will, again, as you've seen in the bill, that will be subject to a new right of appeal. I'm not expecting that to be used very often, but again, it's something that if people feel that they want to appeal to ministers, they'll be able to do that.
Going back to the, so just to kind of specifically ask you, going back to the issue about local authorities, for example, should a local authority apply for funding? Could the minister have a say in whether the local authority gets that funding?
No, in terms of the grant decisions, that's another one where, although at the moment Historic Scotland puts out a significant amount of money to various for various grant schemes, and that will carry on in the new organisation. Again, ministers will set the overall framework for grants. They'll approve the types of schemes, quite probably the quantum of money which will be passed from the new organisation to grant recipients. But the decisions about the individual applications of grant, again, will be taken by the new organisation. Ministers won't have a power of direction over that. So does that help?
So if the board and the minister disagree, it will be the minister will determine the framework, the strategy.
The framework and the strategy, but not in if there was a particular applicant, or local authority or anyone else, who was applying for money from the new organisation, that decision on that particular application would be taken by the new organisation.
Okay. And who will appoint the Board of Historic Environment Scotland?
Ministers will appoint the chair and the board members.
Okay, thanks for that.
Okay, thank you. Liz Smith.
Thank you, Convener. Mrs Murray, you said something very interesting in your the answer to the first question, which is that we need a heritage strategy, and flagging up that we not just need it in Scotland, but we need it around the world. Is one of your reasons for supporting greater ministerial direction, which obviously includes public money funding, do you believe that is one of the strongest reasons for these ministerial powers of direction and strategy, given that, as I say, the overall thing is to have a more coherent strategy?
The heritage strategy is a very interesting piece of work, and I hope you've seen it. And I think it's a fabulous document, which I hope will be a model for others. The strategy was created by a huge amount of consultation, which my colleagues, I'm sure, will talk more about, and across the heritage sector. And the heritage sector feel that a heritage environment strategy for Scotland is something that will provide a framework for the sector, not just for Scottish Government. So it will, I think, again, the Cabinet Secretary has made this quite clear, that the Historic Environment Strategy belongs to Scotland, not just Scottish Government. And that, therefore, the new organisation fits into that very capably, because the new organisation will, one of its tasks will be to lead and enable, which means working with the sector to deliver some of the key aspects of the strategy and align the very diverse heritage sector along a direction which everybody agrees is a better one. I don't think that has, as I said before, I don't think that there is any increase in ministerial direction in this new body than there is in the body that I currently work for.
Okay, that's very helpful. I think there was some discussion whether, at the very early stages, as to whether there might be a move to take away some government involvement. And what I'm interested in is, in terms of having a coherent, fully workable and comprehensive strategy, what is the additional added value that can be brought by government oversight of that strategy, rather than any decision that would have removed it? That's really the key question, I think.
I think having it in government means that it can work across all the other areas of government and be incorporated in, for example, placemaking, in, for example, environment policy, I mean, the historic and the natural environment, of course, are interlocking. In health and well-being, and in all of those areas, I think there's a stronger possibility of the value of the historic environment, both the social and the economic value, being realised rather than having it in a silo where it was previously sitting in Historic Scotland.
Jean Baxter.
I'd like to ask a little bit about the delivery of the strategy. And I think I heard you correctly, Mrs Murray, you said that the strategy doesn't belong to anybody, it belongs to everybody in the sector. And it's really good to hear about something that's been done so inclusively and with so much participation. The Scottish Government's website says that the strategy is owned not by the Government but by the people of Scotland. But I'd be interested, therefore, in who is ultimately responsible for and accountable for the successful delivery of the strategy. And I'd like to hear your comments on that, please.
Well, it's difficult to say since we haven't got the new body operating, but I imagine that the intention is that it will be a partnership between the new body, which will be delivering the strategy and enabling the partnerships in Scotland, all of the other people in the sector, and there are a large number of them, and of course government. And I think the intention is that this will be a partnership exercise, that we will work in collaboration.
Could I just add to that? I think that's very much to build on that. The strategy, there will be a governance structure which will bring together a number of players, government, the various public bodies, voluntary sector, private sector as well. The new body is being deliberately set up as the lead public body to help to deliver the sector, and clearly the chair and chief executive of the new organisation will be part of that governance, and the intention is to also have a number of groups off that which will be looking at particular issues and very much measuring the progress. It will be a very inclusive process which the new organisation will be a lead player across the public sector, but very much one of a very large number.
Thanks. I just follow up. Yes. So you wouldn't see responsibility sitting ultimately at the door of the government, who at the end of the day are elected to deliver a strategy for the people of Scotland?
And clearly has a very important role in bringing all of those players together. Obviously, in terms of particularly across the public sector, then ultimately the money comes from Parliament through government. So it's crucial that government is a key part of that and facilitating that. But ministers and we were as very much part of the process of developing the strategy, being very, very clear that we want to get as many people involved in both the development but the delivery of the strategy as well. But clearly government has a very important role to play in that.
I'm glad to hear it. Thank you.
A very quick supplementary from Liz, please.
Thank you, Convener. Mrs Murray, could I just ask you, you said in answer to Mrs Baxter's question that you imagine it will be. Are you not entirely clear? Because one of the difficulties we had when we looked at Creative Scotland was that nobody seemed entirely sure, and as you know, it led to problems.
I am very clear. I'm just conscious that I've got my colleagues behind me who will be answering questions on the strategy in more detail, and I didn't want to preempt their responses.
Thank you. Thank you. Liam MacArthur.
In the policy memorandum, it talks about historic environment has unrealised potential. I think during our visit there were a number of references to sort of punching below our weight. In your view, is there anything, any particular aspects of the way in which RCAHMS and Historic Scotland have been set up, or the budget constraints under which they're operating, that would point to a reason why we've been punching below our weight over recent times?
I think in terms of the, if I could maybe just start on that, obviously there's always potential to improve and deliver more economic, cultural benefits, all sorts of benefits from the historic environment. I think a lot has actually been achieved over the last number of years when you look at the contribution to the economy, jobs that the historic environment creates. So there's a lot over the last number of years within Historic Scotland ourselves. I think we've seen commercial income, which is obviously all ploughed back into our estate, and all that we do across the historic environment has increased by something like 40% in the last 6 years. So there's real success stories. I think in terms of creating the new organisation, what the bill will do is create a powerful, sustainable new lead body for the historic environment. And a couple of examples of where the whole will be greater than the sum of the parts. Education is one. Both organisations at the moment are involved in education in different ways. By bringing those together under a single governance, I think there will be powerful benefits for families, for learners of all ages, for children. Collections, again, Historic Scotland has 345 fantastic properties across the country. The Royal Commission has a huge collection of images and archives, world class. Again, bringing them together, it's not impossible for them to operate, and there has been a lot of collaboration over a number of years, but bringing them together creates a very powerful entity where, again, both in terms of education, in terms of tourist benefit, bringing them together in that integrated way, I think will enable us to move even further forward.
I mean, in terms of the general perception that we perhaps punch below our weight, I think as we discussed during the visit, there are parts of the country who can lay credible claim to punching above our weight, and I mean Orkney I would cite as one such example. Is there anything that you can offer by way of reassurance that in terms of trying to address this overall perception, that what we don't see is a shifting of focus, resource, attention away from areas which have been doing very well, but I think undoubtedly have the aspiration to do better. Are there reassurances that you can offer in that respect?
I think it's really important that the way the new organisation is set up will allow increased partnership and collaboration across the whole of Scotland, and I think it will be incumbent upon the new board to identify those areas that perhaps need more encouragement, shall we say. But that's not to take away from those areas that are really doing well, and they also need our support. I mean, one of the key things about the new body because it will be an NDPB, if all goes well, it will be able to operate on a more flexible commercial model than Historic Scotland does at the moment. And we hope that will allow both the new body and its partners and those who want to work with it to be able to drive greater economic benefits for all parts of Scotland, as well as increasing social benefits.
Just on that point, one of the issues that's been raised in discussions I've been having over recent weeks is the idea of perhaps a more regionalised structure within the newly merged body. I think English Heritage tends to operate something of that model, and that there appears to be support, particularly in somewhere like Orkney, for a regionalised structure, even if the point person is based somewhere centrally, but who has a responsibility for distinct geographic areas. Is that something that's been discussed? Is there the intention to go down that route?
I think that in terms of Historic Scotland at the moment, obviously we've got staff across the length and breadth of the country in different parts. There's a lot of autonomy for people in the different parts. We have got a regional structure at the moment in terms of our conservation and commercial and tourism. That's something that clearly there will be a new board and a new management who will make decisions about the structure of the new organisation. But I'm sure that's been one of the kind of driving tenets in the last number of years, is to look at how we can develop in areas where particularly more kind of fragile economic areas, where we can look at how our properties, our employment can drive benefits, both cultural and economic, to those areas. So I think that's certainly something that I'm sure the new organisation will want to look at very carefully, actually.
I think that would be helpful. I think the perception is that while there are lots of people on the ground, actually where the decisions are taken is far closer to the centre, and that there's an apprehension that in pulling together a body, there may be administrative simplicity. It may make life easier in some respects, but actually the perception in more rural parts, I would suggest, is that makes it all the more difficult to get to the people who are making decisions that actually matter, and particularly I think in relation to a perception that areas that have been punching below their weight are going to come into sharper focus. I think there needs to be a bit of attention given to how that regional structure might work.
And I think, just to, if I may just come back on that, I think I mean, obviously take the point, and it's something for the new order. I think it's, again, with the new organisation, we'll have the properties across the country in terms of the grant giving that we mentioned earlier. Again, there's money that goes to all parts of the country. And I think it's that opportunity as a new organisation to look at the range of measures, the range of ways in which we invest and support the historic environment across the country, and thinking about them in a regional way, I think is very, it's something I'm sure that we'll want to look at.
Thank you. Patricia Ferguson.
Thank you. I think I was probably quite surprised to hear that you feel that there will be all this greater collaboration when you come together. I'd always expected that you would have collaborated a great deal as two separate organisations, both working in the same field and both working toward the same purpose. However, I wonder whether mention's been made of the commercial side of what the two organisations do. And I wonder whether there are any, if you know what the targets are going to be in terms of the commercial side of the business going forward. Are you increasing the amount of money you're looking for from commercialisation? Is that something that's going to happen? And how will you balance that with the educational side of the work that's done?
At the moment we're looking at a business model which would be similar, and we've done quite a lot of work on this, which would be similar to the business model run by the National Museums, the National Galleries, the National Libraries and the Royal Botanic Gardens, who have the same status as this new body would have. And the idea of that is to allow a proper commercial model to exist. There is certainly scope for driving down core costs, which would allow more money to be used on the front line. There is scope for driving more business through the organisations without any detriment. There's a lot of extra things we could do. For example, the Commission makes increasingly good income from sales of images, and there are plenty of images in Historic Scotland that are not for sale yet, so we could expand that business, for example, and online sales. And then the income, because it's going to be, hopefully, have charitable purposes, which are education and historic environment conservation, then that income would be used to reinvest in conservation, education and historic environment business activities, not just on the tourism-facing side, but more generally. And I think there is potential for that in the body.
Lady Scanlon.
Thank you. I'm also on the audit committee, so we examined Auditor General report in June 2012, Learning the Lessons of Public Body Mergers, and they looked at Skills Development Scotland, who lost 395 staff, Care Inspectorate, Creative Scotland and Marine Scotland. So I'm obviously looking at Learning the Lessons to see if you've also been reading the same document. Can I just ask my first question? One of the key recommendations was that for new mergers to develop and adopt a corporate plan for the new organisation within 12 months of its start, focusing on purpose and benefits and looking at further organisational change and development required to meet these benefits. Do you have your corporate plan?
The things that we've definitely looked at the Audit Scotland recommendations very carefully, and a lot of what we're doing at the moment in terms of joint working, bringing the functions together of the two organisations as much as possible, obviously pending the outcome of the legislation. We're looking to work together. And one of the tasks over the next 12 months is working with staff, working with stakeholders across the country, is to look at taking what's in the strategy, what's in the legislation in terms of the functions of the new organisation, and is to develop that draft corporate plan so that when the new board is appointed and takes up its powers, it has something which actually it will be clearly their decision as to whether to adopt it. But there's been
so you're talking to each other, but you don't have a corporate plan. Can I ask, Convener, when this merger is expected to take place? I'm not sure.
The body would come into existence. The board, the chair would be appointed and the board would be appointed towards the end of this year. and the body will come into existence, we hope, in April 2015, assuming that the parliamentary process goes smoothly.
Okay.
And the powers, the operational activities and the staff will be transferred in October 2015, and from when the board starts work in April 2015, we will have a corporate plan and strategy for presentation to the board, and the board will then discuss that and see whether they wish to adopt it, because we can't preempt what a board decision on a strategy. Neither can we expect a board to create a corporate plan from scratch at that point. So that's the current timetable.
Well, and I don't wish to digress, but on the Audit Committee, one of the issues with the police merger of 8 forces was the lack of a business plan. So, as a new member here, I would find it helpful, and it is a key recommendation, a corporate plan for the new organisation within 12 months of its start date. Yeah. So if the start date is April next year, we should have a corporate plan now, at least next month, within 2 weeks.
Honestly, I would have read that as 12 months after the start date, but which is what we're working
12 months.
I think I would have read that the same way, that it's within 12 months of the start, so that's after.
Yeah.
So you've got from the beginning of the organisation 12 months to put the corporate plan in place.
Well, if I can just go further on, I would hope that there would be some business plan, because you would have to know what the savings were, what the indicators were, what the outcomes were. I mean, is there not something to examine now? Because some of the things that the Auditor General assessed previously, no clear criteria against which to assess whether merged bodies were meeting aims, no clear approach to measure the effect of changes, and the absence of specific objectives clearly articulated, making it difficult for the Scottish Government to measure success. So when can we measure success?
Well,
when will you have outcomes that we can look at, given that we're within 12 months?
We're going through the Managing Successful Projects programme. There was an outline business case which was created last year, and we are currently updating that business case. That has got in it what you're describing, which are the key outcomes and the benefits of this process. And we've also been doing a lot of work on the purpose, vision and values of the new organisation, which have contributed to the bill itself. And the bill itself sets out the functions and the operations of the new organisation quite clearly, and the explanatory notes as well. Now, we've contributed to that, and that will be taken as the core of the new organisation. So we have essentially the purpose, the vision and the values. We're working up across the organisations. We've done a huge amount of work on functional mapping. That is what the organisations do at the moment, right down to quite a lot of detail. We're now building that up with staff so that they can match activities and really merge together rather than just be banged together. We're going to build out of those functional activities the key elements of how the corporate plan will be taken forward. So there's a business plan underpinning the corporate plan, and there will obviously have to be work, which we've started already, on the costings associated with that, and therefore the key performance indicators. So by April next year, we hope all of that will be in place, and the board will actually have a good start on that. And I must say I read it as well as being 12 months after the start date.
Okay, but you do need a business plan prior to that was
Indeed we do,
in the lead up. That was what was missing from the police. So the key performance indicators, they are currently being outlined as you go forward towards the merger, and will they be sufficient to measure success against national outcomes?
Yes. And in terms of that, again, there's two strands to this again, which
I ask because none of the previous mergers achieved that. Yes, so you know, I know you're coming here and it all sounds good, but you know, the previous one, no merged body had assessed net savings. So you know, I'm just looking that lessons have been learned in order to move forward.
I mean, in terms of measuring the effectiveness, the strategy that has just been published obviously sets out very clearly strategic aims for the historic environment, and there is work going on now. There will be one of the groups will be looking at how we measure, and appreciating some of that is quite difficult to measure, the benefits, the progress that is made under the overarching strategy, the functions of the new organisation, and again the work that Diane has just described over the next 12 months, and it will be for the board to look at that. We'll be looking at how we can actually measure progress in delivering the functions that are set out in the bill.
So the measurements aren't in place now, but they will be in place.
Yeah, well, each of the two,
as the bill progresses.
Yeah, and each of the two constituent organisations, which will obviously continue up to the point that the new organisation takes on its powers. Obviously, we have our corporate plans, we have our key performance targets,
and those measures
and
won't just be cost savings; they will be benefit to the new organisation.
Yeah, absolutely. And can I just add, well, in terms of learning from audit. Scotland analysis of previous mergers. Actually, that 6-month period that's enshrined there in the bill, from the 1st of April 2015 to the 1st of October 2015, is very direct learning from Audit Scotland's recommendations in terms of having that, not a cliff edge, but the new board will be there, will be able to make some decisions over a 6-month period while the two organisations continue, and then everything will, the new board will take on its functions, and staff and assets will be transferred 6 months later. So
yes.
That's
okay.
Thank you. Colin Bibby.
Thank you, Peter. Perhaps I can start just by declaring an interest in that I'm a life member of Historic Scotland, and additionally my domestic residence has an A listing from Historic Scotland. Just looking at the bill, I'm looking at some of the terminology that's used there that appears to be perhaps less than well defined. For example, historic environment. There doesn't appear to be a definition in the bill of this, and the policy memorandum seems to be a bit abstract in what it means by that. How comfortable are you with these definitions?
I think the strategy provides very clear definition of the historic environment, which again has been worked on, as we discussed earlier, with lots of people, huge amount of consultation. And the new organisation is being deliberately set up as a lead public body to deliver that strategy. And I suppose, in our view, the bill is very much there to set up the new organisation to deliver the strategy. I think it's probably more appropriate for that definition to be in the strategy rather than in the bill.
I mean, the other definitions that I'm concerned about are things like collection and objects, which are very generic in a way. How is that going to be defined?
The terms used in the bill are the same as those used for the National Library of Scotland bill, quite deliberately, because and also apply to the National Museums and the National Galleries, so that it gives the scope for collections to change, just as in the last 10 years we have seen a huge change from material collections, paper, for example, and photographs, to now most of our collections that come in are in digital form. So it allows that range by just using that terminology, and it, as I say, it matches the National Library of Scotland definitions as well.
Saying is it's really deliberate to have catch-alls.
Yes.
Does that create any legal issues in terms of, if you've not defined what an object is or what a collection is? Does that create any legal issues for the new body?
I don't think it creates legal issues, not any of that I'm aware of. What normally happens in national collections is that the national body has a collecting policy and a collections policy, and we've spoken with the other national collections to make sure that we have an alignment with the type of collecting policies that we all have, and that we're not overlapping in terms of what we collect. And make sure that that is to the standards of the archive, museum and heritage worlds.
I think you mentioned a very important thing there about overlapping. Where you have these sort of general definitions, there is a danger of overlap with other organisations, other collecting organisations. Are you satisfied that that won't happen?
I'm satisfied that it doesn't happen at the moment, and I'm satisfied that it won't happen in the future.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I call Liam MacArthur?
Thank you, Convener. you've touched on it in the earlier responses, but obviously there's an intention for the newly merged body to be established as the charity in due course. Could you perhaps outline what you see as the, or what are seen as the advantages of that, and any disadvantages that may occur as a result?
As we said a few moments ago, the policy memorandum sets out the clear charitable purpose for the organisation. That was something that was set out in terms of looking after assets and collections on behalf of the nation, long-term education, community heritage. That charitable purpose was set out in the outline business case last May, on which the government consulted, and there were questions raised during the consultation, but broadly speaking, people were satisfied that charitable purpose was sound. Obviously, we've talked all the way through with the Office of the Scottish Charity Regulator as well, and they're comfortable that what is set out in terms of the functions of the new organisation, that combination of functions, would qualify for charitable status if that's what the board decides to apply for charitable status. I think in terms of some of the benefits, it would put the new organisation very much on the same sort of footing, obviously clear precedent with the other national collections within Scotland and elsewhere in the UK, where organisations with culture and heritage functions and similar charitable purpose have got charitable status. So that the new organisation will be a very powerful player within that national collections field, will be able to collaborate on the same sort of footing as they have opportunities to go work together. I think as well with organisations across the historic environment, including obviously the National Trust for Scotland. And obviously we've had very close dialogue with the National Trust for Scotland about charitable purpose, and they've raised questions as well. But what we're looking at is the opportunity with the national collections, with other players in the voluntary sector, to look at partly the buildings, certainly, which Historic Scotland, more than the archives, the collections more generally, and trying to look not at them compartmentalised by organisation, but as a wider national collection for Scotland of buildings and artefacts of the highest status. So I think it will give those sort of opportunities to play in that sort of field.
I mean, sorry.
I was going to say the Royal Commission is a charitable body at the moment, and the commissioners are also trustees of the charity. The Royal Commission will be dissolved under this bill, and its functions will be taken on by the new body. Commissioners and trustees would find it really quite hard to transfer their responsibilities to an organisation that was not a charity, because they have a trustee relationship, obviously, with the collections and the assets of the organisation. In addition, we run SCRAN, which is the main provider of web cultural assets into schools, every school in Scotland, as well as most of the libraries in Scotland, and wider than that to people who want to subscribe for lifelong learning purposes. SCRAN is a charity, and it operates in partnership with the Royal Commission as a subsidiary charity. If the new body was not a charitable body, then we would have to dislocate SCRAN from the new organisation, and it would have to set up in a different way. I think ministers felt that the advantage of having SCRAN alongside and involved with the new body would be very advantageous, because we benefit hugely from its activities, and there's a great deal of crossover in the work that we do. So that was another element of why the new body, if it does decide to apply for charitable status, would have a major advantage of that charitable benefit.
I mean, both those answers are helpful in setting out the justification and obviously the benefits of charitable status, but they were perhaps slightly less illuminating in relation to the potential disadvantages. And I think it's clear that a number of bodies are concerned about the implications of HES taking on charitable status, because of the displacement effect of funding applications that might be made. I think National Trust, university departments, all of those operate in a similar space, and therefore is there not a danger that what you simply see is the newly merged body moving into an environment and crowding out limited amounts of funding that's available for those partner organisations? And is there not also a concern that what you see is effectively heritage lottery funding coming in to replace what previously has been government grant funding, which obviously goes against the grain of what lottery funding was intended to do?
If I could maybe just start on that. Just give you your last point first in terms of Heritage Lottery Fund. I mean, both our organisations and obviously the other national collections which are NDP's charitable status are able to apply for the lottery at the moment. So that, and we have successfully applied for lottery funding. So the more general point, we see this, and again, the precedent is there. Lots of different organisations, culture and heritage field, have got charitable status at the moment. What we want to do is work with them, and obviously with the voluntary sector, the other organisations, to take the opportunity of, in a sense, growing the cake is a term that's been used in terms of both heritage tourism, but in terms of diversifying the funding for the sector more generally. And our feeling is that working collaboratively under the aegis of the strategy is that actually there are opportunities in all sorts of ways for an organisation coming into that field with charitable status, with that different kind of reach and field, to actually work with others to grow the overall pot of income, of cultural value, of economic value. And as I said a few moments ago, working with the National Trust for Scotland, obviously we work very closely with them. Just in the last couple of weeks we've opened the new Bannockburn Heritage Centre, where Historic Scotland and NTS have worked extremely closely for the last 3 or 4 years. What we want to do is to try and look at a national heritage collection, buildings, archives, all the museums, the galleries, and work together in terms of targeting different, prioritising investment, working with the Heritage Lottery Fund at the rate at which applications come to them. So I think there are real opportunities actually to do that. So we can't see particular downsides from charitable status.
Clearly those concerns are being expressed, and I think the creation of a larger single entity, presumably the concern is that what you have is such a single dominant player that the partnership is difficult to discern. Other than this is what we're doing, you can come along with us if you want. I'm not sure how you get round that, but I think it perhaps does go some way to help explaining what that nervousness is, and how you might see a risk of displacement of activity and available funding. But I mean, I think one other issue is raised.
Anybody had something to say on this? I think.
Sorry. If you don't mind, I think it's helpful to unpick a bit about the competition in charities, because one of the advantages of having this body as a charitable body is that it actually puts the current competition on a level playing field. At the moment, members of Historic Scotland get a better deal because it's not a charity than they will if it is a charity. Now, the National Trust for Scotland have always complained about that, because you get 20% discount. Sorry, I know you remember. You get 20% discount in the shops, and they always complain that actually members get a greater discount than their members do. Now, as a charity, the new organisation will have to abide by the membership benefits that all charities abide by, and that includes the magazine and the car parking and all of these other things. So that will be, in many ways, better, because it will mean the competition will be level. And I think the other thing you have to bear in mind is most of the charitable, apart from the charitable benefits that you gain from tax and rate relief and so on, the main purpose in charities is raising revenue and philanthropic giving. Now, most of that usually comes around a particular project, and that happens with the National Trust for Scotland. I was, for a time, on the board of the National Trust for Scotland. So if they have a big ask, like the Burn Centre or whatever, they will ask their members for money for that particular exercise. If the National Museum asks for philanthropic giving for their new building, and people who give money like that tend to, if they're interested in paintings, they're not interested in buildings. And so you're actually looking at a widespread. And I think, actually, by working together, we might be able to improve the way that we do development work of that kind. Not having one development officer for both organisations, for example, but just to I know that fundraisers and development officers actually do work together and work out how they can best work to effect for the benefit of their organisations. So I think that, it sounds as though it's a real problem, but I think once you start looking into the detail, it becomes quite a much smaller issue than people think.
Okay, one brief question. Yeah, simply through the consultation, there were also concerns that Historic Environment Scotland may be at an unfair advantage should it be able to access its own grants or apply different standards to applications for listed building or scheduled monument consents relating to the sites it directly manages. And is there anything in that where you could provide sort of reassurance?
It's wrong. We won't.
You won't. Okay, it's helpful.
Thank you for that. Can I call Claire Adamson? Just before I do that, though, I'm going to finish with Claire's questions on this. I know we haven't finished all of the stuff. As I said at the beginning, I suspected we wouldn't get through all of this today, but we will write to the organisations. And then with the second panel, we start off where we're leaving off on this panel, just so that members are aware of where we're going on this. Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I'd like to ask around the area of the staffing of proposed Historic Environment Scotland organisation and the dissolution of RCAHMS and what implications that may have, particularly for RCAHMS staff. The financial memorandum talks about, the policy memorandum rather says that the envisaged new organisation would have 1,100 staff. But if you combine the two existing staffs, there's 1,170, including temporary staff at RCAHMS. Can you confirm that any loss of post will be done? Sorry, I've lost a bit in my notes here. It would be the staffing. It would be in the context of a voluntary early exit scheme, and given that there's also a commitment in the financial memorandum that there would be no loss of detriment to existing terms and conditions for staff, how will the envisaged savings be made?
So maybe start on that and then pass it around. I mean, firstly, government has made it very clear that the government's policy of no compulsory redundancies will apply in this, and that's been made very clear. So there will be no compulsory redundancies to the merger. As you say, staff will, again, very, very clear that staff will transfer to the new organisation without detriment, so on existing terms and conditions. In terms of the financial memorandum and the staff savings, for both organisations, obviously, across the public sector, are looking at the moment, have been for a while, at how, as we said earlier, can reduce costs and increase income and benefits. So we've been doing that. We have, in both organisations over the last 2 or 3 years, have had voluntary early severance schemes, which will be generating savings as we move forward, and just looking at more efficient ways of doing the business, looking at how, through natural wastage over a number of years, we can, look at functions being carried out in a more efficient way. So that's the way that we've projected the staff savings over the 12-year period, but it is very clearly not through compulsory redundancy.
All the staff and assets will transfer to the new organisation. So the staff from the Royal Commission will transfer. They are currently public servants, and they will be public servants in the new body with the same terms and conditions. We're harmonising terms and conditions, but they're very, very similar at the moment anyway. The staff from Historic Scotland are civil servants at the moment, and there will be a big change for them in the sense that they will become public servants, although those two things are very, very close. I think they won't actually notice a huge difference, but as I say, the terms and conditions will stay the same, I think, as Ian said.
So could you just make just one other point on that as well? We've obviously been working very closely with the 4 constituent unions over the last 18 months and are continuing to do that on all of this, and they've been very comfortable with where we are on that. And just the final point, I suppose, is we've made it very clear that people will transfer without detriment on kind of two-pay basis to the new organisation. But if people, for whatever reason, felt that they didn't want to, there is a term common citizenship across the Scottish administration, its various agencies and NDPBs, which people will be negotiating with the Scottish Government that at least 2 years, and there's a commitment to that, 2 years beyond the vesting day of the new organisation, that common citizenship will apply, so that people who want to apply for a job anywhere in that family of organisations will be able to do that. And we hope that will be extended beyond the 2 years, but it will certainly be 2 years. So again, there's that. We would hope that no one would not want to join the new organisation. We'll work very closely with them, but there is that assurance as well.
Thank you very much.
And in keeping with my generous nature, a very small supplementary to Mr. Ferguson.
Thank you, Convener. As you know, I always say how generous you are when I have the opportunity, but I thank you for your generosity this morning. I'm always slightly concerned when we talk about things like natural wastage and no detriment to staff, because inevitably you cannot choose which members of staff will decide to opt to leave whichever organisation. And I'm conscious that Historic Scotland's not had its troubles to seek, perhaps, in recent times, in terms of some of its staffing and issues there. But how will you ensure that you're able to retain people who have the correct skill sets for the work that the organisation will want to do going forward, and that the people you lose are not the people who happen to have all the experience and all the institutional knowledge that is needed to take forward the kind of posts and the kind of work that the organisation wants to do?
Well, if I could just go back to my point I made earlier about how we're doing the corporate planning, and the fact that we are actually looking at the functions across both organisations and identifying activities where people can work together. We're doing our absolute best to engage all members of staff in their future, so that they will help build their future in their particular areas of activity, which, how often does an organisation get the opportunity to really look at what they're doing and think about how they're going to do that in the future? So we're trying to get all staff involved in that, and that will help us identify and, I hope, secure the skills that we need. We also had 69% staff engagement index on the recent staff survey that we did, which is one of the highest in the UK, I believe. So staff are engaged. They do want to be part of this. They do want to be involved. And so that's in terms of morale, that's one of the pieces that we're trying to do to try and keep people on board. There is no, the natural wastage is just one of those things that we have to be able to plan around. And if we do lose key skills, like you do when people retire, we will be looking to, and we are already doing succession planning to make sure that the skills when people leave the organisation are vested in some of the younger members of staff. So we are conscious of that. We also have organisational development work going on, which is just about to start. So we're hoping to invest in the staff as we move forward.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. We haven't got through, as I indicated earlier, we haven't got through all of the questions we wanted to. Given the time, I want to move on to the second panel, but so we will write to you, if you don't mind, with a number, quite a substantial number, I think, questions that we have, and we'll look forward to your response. But can I thank you for coming along this morning and giving us your oral evidence, and I'll suspend very briefly while we change witness panels. can I welcome our second panel of witnesses today from the Scottish Government. We have Andrew Fleming, Noel Foyett, David Fleetwood, Jenny Marshall and Emma Thompson. Thank you very much for coming along this morning. And can I begin by inviting Noel, who's the Bill Team Leader, to make some brief opening remarks. It says Noel in my... Is that right?
I'm just going to delegate that to my boss. Andrew Fleming will make the opening statement, if I may. I
apologise, Andrew.
No, that's fine. It's no problem at all. Thank you very much for the opportunity to give evidence today. The Cabinet Secretary announced in July 2012 that RCAHMS and Historic Scotland should merge with their combined functions to be delivered by a new lead body for the historic environment. This action will support the long-term sustainability of the functions of both organisations to create a new body that's equipped to help lead and support the delivery of Scotland's first historic environment strategy. The historic environment is easy to take for granted, we would argue, but it needs careful management, active engagement and a clear sense of direction. Challenges such as climate change bring additional maintenance burdens, and the individuals and organisations who look after the historic environment face real financial pressures, especially at this time. There are also opportunities as well for the historic environment, such as technological advances. Also heightened public engagement and expectations. More people with leisure time who want to engage and participate in the historic environment in new and different ways. These are great opportunities, but they also bring financial consequences too. Fundamentally, the historic environment is a precious asset, providing real benefits for Scotland's people. However, there is a persistent belief, and we've heard about it earlier on today in the evidence session, that despite the great work done by government-funded bodies and the many third sector organisations and thousands of individuals, that actually Scotland's historic environment could deliver so much more. We began work 2 years ago with key stakeholders to consider what changes and to existing policies and ways of working might improve performance across the sector. The outcome of this work was actually Scotland's first historic environment strategy, which was published alongside the bill this month. The strategy commits us to a genuinely shared approach for Scotland's historic environment on protection, management and promotion. It provides clear direction for the long-term ambition to do more by way of securing economic, social and cultural benefits. And it brings together the sector within a governance structure and a series of working groups to take forward that vision in partnership. Now that we have a sector-wide agreement on collaboration through the strategy and consensus on the challenges and the opportunities, government needs to set an example. We can't exhort to others to work together yet continue to support two separate bodies. Thus, the creation of the single body, we believe, will build resilience and sustain the existing functions. It will maintain the expertise and knowledge base for the long term. It will simplify the landscape with only one national organisation to deal with when seeking information and advice. It will deliver greater efficiency via shared services and help realise the opportunities which technological advances and public engagement offer us. It will create new opportunities to collaborate and work in partnership across partner bodies and with our other national collection bodies. And finally, it will establish a lead delivery partner for the historic environment strategy. Working hand in hand with the wider sector, Historic Environment Scotland will promote more effectively the potential of the historic environment to create better sense of place, identity, physical and social well-being, and thereby benefit the economy, civic participation, tourism and lifelong learning. The new arrangements also address current concerns about transparency in relation to regulation, grant giving and relationship with ministers. The bill will ensure the new body operates on a level playing field, which we know is of importance to other bodies. It will function as another of Scotland's national collection alongside the National Museum of Scotland, National Gallery for Scotland and National Library of Scotland, increasing collaboration and partnership working. In brief, the bill will establish Historic Environment Scotland and NDPB, combining functions, staff and assets of Historic Scotland and the Royal Commission. The bill sets out its functions of Historic Environment Scotland and how it will be governed. It provides for the delegation or transfer of ministerial powers and responsibilities and enables the transfer of property, staff and assets. It provides for changes to the legislation, principally to ensure that Historic Environment Scotland is added to schedules for consultation and other purposes and for the dissolution of the Royal Commission. And finally, it simplifies procedures in respect of heritage management to ensure that regulation of the historic environment aligns better with the planning system, delivering a more proportionate and efficient system of designation and consents. As I've said, the bill sets out in one place the historic environment functions which this government wants to see sustained and developed, as well as defining the duties for Historic Environment Scotland of investigating, caring for and promoting our historic environment. This is also an affirmation of the government's support for that important task. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And just for members' benefit, I intend to start where we left off with the ones we missed out on the first panel, and I'll come back to members who raised questions earlier after that. If members can, if the question has been answered and they don't feel it's necessary to repeat it, then you can move on to other areas of questioning. So please indicate as we move on when you want to come in. But I'm going to start with George.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. In appointing, I'd like to ask about equalities. In appointing the board of the new body, the bill states that the Minister must appoint in a manner which encourages equal opportunities. How are we going to best encourage that to happen?
My colleague Noel to pick on that question.
The bill follows a very similar line to the post-16 education provision in respect of equalities. The issue is not so much that the bill will provide for equalities or in the way the board is selected, or indeed diversity in the way the organisation operates. But I think you're quite right. There is a difficulty in encouraging a sufficiently large field of qualified candidates to come forward. There'll need to be advertising to cast the net really wide to make sure we get a good quality, good range of applicants coming forward. It is sometimes perceived that this sector, the historic environment, is a little bit narrow in focus. It tends to be, as it were, the same sorts of people who come forward time and time again. So how one actually gets more equality is simply by putting out the message. There's a new organisation here, it's got a new mission, there's a strategy, the vision of what this organisation and the wider strategic approach can actually achieve, we hope will attract candidates to come forward from a very wide range of backgrounds so we can actually achieve that. But at the end of the day, one can only appoint to the board from the candidates who put themselves forward. So it's not so much the policy within the bill, it's how we actually get the message out there. There's a really big, a really important, a really exciting job to be done, and it doesn't just require the same suspects to come forward as have come forward in the past, those with narrow specialist interests. This is about what the whole changes can actually bring to improve things. And it is difficult. It's difficult, I think, to get that sort of candidate, the wide range of candidates coming forward from many public bodies. I'm sure the new body will not be alone in that.
Okay. Can I ask another question as well? The bill also requires the new body promote the diversity of persons accessing the historical environment. Now, I'm coming from a perspective of my wife's a wheelchair user, and I know that some of the places and some of the buildings that are involved in all this aren't the best place for a day out if you've got a wheelchair. You know, so from the equalities point of view, how are you going to influence that to get these people to actually access the historical environment?
In some cases, we may have to accept it is simply physically impossible. There will always be some properties which are not going to be physically accessible. And I think that you will know far better than me that there's an acceptance that only so much can be done in terms of physical adaptation. I think what can be done may be in the form of improved access in using modern technology. For example, there is a proposal which has been talked about quite a lot now to provide access to some sites which are in effect inaccessible to everyone by having video cameras on site places like St Kilda, which are very difficult to access for anyone. Even somebody who's fit and well like us, particularly if you get seasick. So the idea that you can actually do much more about providing a high quality of virtual access, I think, is one area which will be important. That said, there are situations where careful adaptation of properties can actually allow more access for people who have mobility problems. Equally, there are issues about the way in which information is provided on sites. Very frequently, the information is not particularly friendly to people who are partially sighted or don't have sight. And again, there's probably more that can be done, again, using technology, using audio guiding, for example, which is becoming much more efficient and no longer as clunky as it used to be. There's a lot which can be done in that way as well. And these are directions in which Historic Scotland and indeed the Royal Commission are already moving. This is really just trying to bring that together and make it move in that direction. It's using what's already best practice and applying it more widely.
One thing we've found from practical, our own experience, is that the Europeans seem to do it a lot better than we do when you go to some of their access to their historic buildings. We all seem to have, it's a lot easier for us to get about and to be invited. Is there any way we've actually possibly looked at some of the kind of things they've done abroad to when we're getting this together?
I think it's fair to say that the staff of both organisations are I was going to say habitual, very much in favour of seeing what happens abroad. There are some very good practices abroad. There are also some very good practices in this country. But it does take time and it does take resource to actually spread those improved facilities around the various properties. And that is very much a key objective of both organisations to give that access. But there is only so much that can be done at a certain time with the budget, with the other calls on it. There is also the question of conserving those properties, so much point in providing access to them if they're actually falling down. So there is a need to make a balance between what can be done to improve facilities and what has to be done simply to maintain the asset for the present and future generations. But those are very much issues which are, I have to say, in the forefront of both organisations' minds.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just pick up where George Adam left off? For example, if you were in a wheelchair and you wanted to access a historic property, I think everybody accepts there are some parts of that property you'll be unable to access, no matter how much effort you go to. Does that person pay the same entrance fee as somebody who's fully able to get up the towers and access other parts of the building? Or do they get a discount based on the fact that they cannot access all of the property?
I think we need to look and get back to you on that particular issue. My initial response is I think it's the same price, but I would need to double check that.
Because I would have thought that that's clearly the qualities issue if somebody is physically unable to access the full range of the property, and while others can, why they should pay the same price. Well, okay, I'll move on, and I'd be grateful for an answer when you've got the information. What do you do in terms of discounts if you take a broad definition of equalities? What do you do in terms of discounts for people who are perhaps unemployed or on benefits or not working and have a full wage to use for them and their families to visit the properties?
I mean, is that you're asking about the current practice?
Yes.
In there. I mean, again, I would need to get back to you and check on that. I think there is a discount scheme for that as well, but if I can come back and ask a complete answer on that. I mean, I think in terms of the bill, I think the issue here is what we're doing is putting a duty on the body to promote better access, more accessible access around equalities issues. So one of the challenges we'll be asking the new body to take on is actually to look at these issues and trying to see what they can do to address those issues.
The reason I asked it and the way I asked it is because if you don't know what's happening now, it's difficult to see where the improvements would be. But I'd be grateful if you gave us a full answer
certainly can
subsequent to the meeting. Thank you. I'll move on now with Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. The Scottish ministers have something like 345 properties in their care, and I believe the intention is to delegate that responsibility to the new Historic Environment Scotland. Do you know the extent to which that's going to happen? Is it going to be all those properties? Is it going to be full delegation of responsibilities, or what?
The current arrangements are that the ownership or title of those properties will rest with Scottish ministers, but what they will do is, through a scheme of delegation, delegate the actual operation of all of those 345 sites to the to Historic Environment Scotland. And through that delegation, there'll be a clearer specificity of what the conservation standards are, any pricing issues, public access issues, and indeed potentially the equalities issues that Mr Maxwell raised there as well could be included in that scheme of delegations. So ministers will set out very clearly their expectations about what they want the body to deliver, and there'll be a clear, transparent process for assessing whether that body is meeting those requirements.
Will that be on an individual property basis or generic?
It will be a generic scheme of delegations, but it will have specific references where that's applicable.
My understanding is that any revenue streams that come from these particular properties will accrue to Historic Environment Scotland. Obviously, any change in that could affect the viability of the organisation, because I would imagine these revenue streams are quite substantial. Has there been anything put in place to guarantee that?
For government to guarantee the revenue streams coming in?
To guarantee that the revenue streams will accrue to the organisation. Obviously, they can't say what the level will be because that depends on visits and so on.
I mean, the revenue stream will go to the body, and that's absolutely clear, and that's a clear policy intention.
What sort of proportion of the income of the new body will that be?
You're talking, I think the gross income is around £30 million out of about £70 million.
So it's quite significant.
Liam MacArthur.
Colin Beattie's referred to revenue streams. Of course, there's plenty of properties in care where there is no revenue stream. I can think of half a dozen in my own constituency in Orkney. Are there any guarantees in terms of the requirements to maintain and upkeep those properties where obviously there's not the incentive of looking at different ways of increasing revenue streams?
I mean, I think the great opportunity here is because we're actually setting up a scheme of delegation where you can be much clearer and more transparent that actually it is about the conservation of the whole estate, the 345, and not simply the ones that actually make a commercial profit, if you like. So I think the intention in the scheme of delegation is to specify conservation standards for across the entire estate.
Okay, thank you very much. Neil Bibby.
Thanks, Convener. Can I ask you to confirm what powers will transfer from the individual bodies to Scottish Government ministers, and why does the Scottish Government and minister feel they need this additional power?
Could you explain that question again? Sorry.
What powers will transfer from individual bodies to Scottish Government ministers as a result of this bill?
I mean, at the moment, all the powers that, kind of exist with Scottish ministers as it currently stands. What we're doing is actually transferring powers to the new body, Historic Environment Scotland, and retaining powers within Scottish ministers.
Okay.
If you wish, I can try and...
No, that's fine. I mean, no additional powers have been moved from individual bodies to Scottish Government ministers. Right, okay, that's fine.
So, sorry, I would quite like to know what the split is, if you were about to explain it there.
Well, if I can try and do this, and I'll maybe need my colleagues' help to do this because there's quite an array of things. I mean, the first thing to say is that, and we've heard discussion around it, is the strategic policy function now sits with the Scottish Government. So that's one element of function that previously sat in Historic Scotland, and that responsibility for the whole of the historic environment. That function has moved into the Scottish Government and did so before, it did so last year, as an issue that fell out of the strategy. And you've heard discussion earlier around that and the need for a more holistic approach to looking at government policy and the historic environment within that. In terms of the powers that are transferring to the new body, the power to designate the historic environment in the heritage management area is transferring. Ministers are retaining their powers and properties and care, the title of that, but delegating responsibility for the operation of them to the new body. To the powers around conservation are going to the new body, and powers around collections are going to the new body. And I'm going to ask Noel if you can pick up on things I've missed out in that sort of list there.
Yes, I think the key here is the new body will be doing the things that require decisions to be made based on professional knowledge, so that ministers, although they will keep an overall power to guide and direct the organisation as appropriate for an organisation that's receiving rather a lot of public money, despite its earnings, that nonetheless that ministers will be not getting involved in what you might call casework, so individual grant applications, decisions on what is done in a piece of individual conservation work on the property, how the collections, which are currently held by the Royal Commission in Historic Scotland, the archives and so on, how they are managed. That will be, on a day-to-day basis, something where the ministers will not have an involvement, but ministers will keep an overall responsibility for that. But in general, what you might call the operational activities will all move across to the new body, leaving ministers, as it were, to look at the direction in which the great ship Historic Environment Scotland is sailing, rather than interfering with the works of the individual officers and crew on that ship.
In terms of delivery of the strategy, the board will obviously be set some outcomes to meet. What will happen if the board does not meet its expected outcomes?
Well, the two roles here in terms of Scottish ministers, one of which is the Scottish minister's responsibility for establishing the overall policy and strategic context for the historic environment, broadly defined. And then there's also the responsibility for setting and accounting for the role of the organisation. In the specific question you're asking, ministers will hold the board of that body accountable for the delivery of its targets where specified in the corporate plan. That corporate plan is agreed in dialogue between the body and ministers, and once set will establish clearly what the requirements of the body are, and ministers through their sponsorship role will hold that body to account and indeed report to Parliament on that progress, as would be normal for a public body.
Okay, and just if I can ask a kind of just again a more general question, how will this merger be different or an improvement on previous organisational changes that have taken place?
I think what I would say here is that the two elements to this merger, and in some sense we've been discussing these in the hearings and earlier, is one is the strategy for the historic environment, which has been broadly developed with the sector and shared, setting out a broad direction of activity around which the sector as a whole can promote better benefits for the historic environment and for the people of Scotland. That's one element of this, and the other is the simple merging of two bodies together. The benefits that we're getting here are actually the fact that actually in creating a new body to deliver the strategy, we're getting much more partnership working, cohesive activity that's going to have a greater impact on communities. Now, those you may want to ask me where will those areas and benefits actually come? Well, they will be in terms of the educational functions we've heard around that, but also in terms of placemaking. The historic environment is a very key element in making good places for people to live and work. It provides context. The historic environment connects people to their place. By protecting the historic environment and enhancing it in line with the development of areas, you can create better townscapes, cityscapes, places to live. People participate in that. They engage through civic participation, through volunteering engagement, and you create better well-being and for ordinary people. And that's a very key element. There are other elements. Oh, sorry, I thought you were... So,
I thought it was being stuck.
I mean, I can stop there because there are other benefits here. Because
I think you should, if you don't mind stopping there, because I want, and that sounds fantastic. Yeah. That sounds great. But who, and we've heard a lot about the strategy, who is ultimately responsible for the successful delivery of the strategy? Because that's not been so clear.
Okay. The strategy essentially is a partnership arrangement involving a range of different bodies that have their own reporting arrangements. The National Trust for Scotland, voluntary sectors, individuals to some extent, and professional bodies and groups. In a sense, you're asking us, can government actually control all of those entities? And clearly it can't. What a government can do, and through the chairing of that board by the Cabinet Secretary, is an attempt to bring the bodies together so that they can together move together to deliver good outcomes for the historic environment, to persuade, to encourage, to engage to try and achieve that outcome. Ultimately, the Cabinet Secretary has taken on board the strategy. It's published by the Scottish Government, but we've made very clear that it's a product of collective endeavours around the sector. And as a result, we seek to then take that forward through the governance structure and the various working groups that sit underneath that.
I'm not entirely convinced by that, because effectively the government publishes a strategy, and then it's a kind of collective. Sounds very touchy-feely, but a collective responsibility for the sector generally to be who are responsible and accountable. I'm not quite getting a clear lines of responsibility and accountability from that answer.
In a sense, one of the challenges we might get then from would be, can government could government tell the NTS what to do or what not to do? And clearly the answer to that is not, because the NTS is a private body. But the NTS is a fundamental player in the delivery of the historic environment strategy. And as a result, we would want to work together with that, with kind of that. Indeed, Cabinet Secretary already has many discussions with that, to agree common projects and plans to take them forward collectively. And that's the broad structure around that. There are individual groups sitting underneath that which seek to take forward individual endeavours, education, volunteering, working with local government, heritage tourism, but also one talking about measuring success. So the sector can actually agree what good outcomes actually are, and then can actually collectively endorse and take that forward. And this sort of outcome is very, very similar to the process of taking forward early years intervention, in a sense, by bringing people together to bring resources together, as well as, say, in justice outcomes and those sorts of areas. It would be an example of those endeavours.
Okay, I have a couple of members who want in on this. Is it on this particular? Yeah, Liam MacArthur and then Liz Smith.
I mean, interesting you point to the issue of early intervention. Obviously, we've just completed the Children and Young People's Bill, where there was a similar concern to the one that the convener, I think, was alluding to there, that if everybody is responsible, the danger is that nobody is responsible, and in a sense that was one of the underpinning arguments for a named person approach. I mean, listening to your initial remarks, you seem to suggest that the merger of this body was critical to the delivery of the strategy, that without the merging of RCAHMS and Historic Scotland, you couldn't have the strategy in anything like its current form. Is that your view?
I think it's much harder to do that. The sector is by its nature quite diverse, has a lot of players, but also it delivers a policy outcome which supports many others. It's more of a second division issue rather than a first division issue in other areas. So it supports planning and placemaking, it supports well-being, it supports regeneration, it supports other different public policy areas. So by, if you like, bringing it together, you can actually, in this sort of way, around a strategy, shared outcomes, you can achieve much more influence in other public policy agendas.
I mean, I can understand why the rationale as to why you would then bring it together and what you may expect to benefit from it. But what you would lose, I would suggest, is the distinctive characters and characteristics of the two individual organisations. And it's been suggested to me that, in a sense, what you have with RCAHMS is very much an impartial organisation that provides advice and support and operates and functions in a very different way from Historic Scotland, which perhaps of necessity has been more partial and whatnot. And therefore, by bringing those two organisations together, it's difficult to see how you retain the best elements of both. The organisation, in order to function, presumably has to adopt a character, whatever that character may be. And I mean, therefore, is that not what we're going to lose?
No, well, I think one of the things in creating an NTPB is what you're doing is you're giving proper place to the professionalism and the professional decision-making that sits around all the decisions. While I could see the way you might typify the Royal Commission as being more of an academic, objective institution, I think that professionalism and objectivity also exists within the Historic Scotland, be it around decisions around consents, listings and those sorts of things. The academic rigour is very much part.
No, I mean, I wasn't at all suggesting there was a lack of professionalism or rigour within RCAHMS, but actually the way in which they engaged with the sector, I think, reflected the character of the organisation, and what I think I'm struggling to understand is how you retain that, because presumably what you have is a body that has a character and has an approach that is going to be consistent across the organisation.
Noel Dole's been asked to say some of that.
Yeah, I think I should probably declare an interest. I worked for Historic Scotland for 30 years before I transferred to Scottish Government about 6 months ago. And I think it is the case that the organisations have distinct characters, but also within the organisations, particularly within Historic Scotland, there are distinct sub-characters. So if you're dealing with the architects about a matter of architectural conservation, you'll be speaking a different language to if you were dealing with the commercial and tourism people about developing a tourist activity. And I think in a new organisation, these new, what you might call subcultures, will, I'm sure, exist. So there will be different types of language, different types of interaction going on, depending on the purpose of the interaction. In terms of the clear separation, it's also sometimes, I think, forgotten that it's not always useful to have impartial information. If you're a developer or somebody thinking about buying a plot of land, at the moment you would go to the Royal Commission and you would say, tell me what historic environment features of interest there are in this land. And they will give you a very, very helpful, responsible answer. Nowadays, online, you can probably do it for yourself. Your next question will probably be, and what does that mean I can do and can't do on that land? To which the answer is that you'll have to go and speak to Historic Scotland. That will disappear. So that's one of the aspects of the distinct cultures which is possibly holding things back in terms of the bigger vision of working together. So I think it swings and roundabouts. I think there will be distinctive cultures within that organisation. They will certainly evolve and change over time. The Historic Scotland I work for now is nothing like the organisation I worked for when I worked for until recently. It's nothing like the organisation I worked for when I joined it 30 years ago. And that does happen over time. The key question is whether or not those changes in culture are actually changes in culture which are driving towards more openness, more joining up with the information, and something which is actually better for the users of the services of these organisations. And that's got to be the key test. And that is something I'm sure which ministers will be holding the new organisation very firmly to account for.
Thank you. Liz Smith.
Mr Fleming, could I be absolutely clear about this strategic accountability? And before I ask this question, can I just declare an interest in being a member of the National Trust? You said in your answer that the strategy that you have in front of you was a collaborative piece of work that put together a whole lot of people who have decided on the key strategic points. And I think I heard you correctly when you said that the National Trust was part of that, but obviously they're not a body where the government would be able to tell them what to do. Now, what happens in any situation where the strategic interests are not quite agreed in terms of one specific issue, and it's a body, the issue relates to a body where the government does not have that power of direction? Who is really accountable for any problems within the strategy?
I mean, it's very difficult to talk about, to try and put that into a very specific context. I mean, I think the point here is that we are collectively agreeing that these are good outcomes. There will be ways of working around any particular issue, I imagine, but the point is what we've done by bringing everyone together to agree the strategy, we have, if you like, a moral agreement that this is a good thing, that we should all work together. There will always be arrangements about who's best placed, who's available, who can actually take forward individual projects. They'll have to be negotiated on the ground in individual circumstances. But I mean, I suppose for me, the issue here is that this document is very much akin to, to George Reid's Team Scotland approach. They identified about working together across the sector, about sharing, not competing, collaborating, trying to find ways to work together. Some of the principles about sharing information, about working together are enshrined in that, which in many cases it could be described as a very simple thing. We all want to do that, and in most of our lives we all do that. But actually this has been quite an important document and a milestone document for the sector, which I'm sure when you speak to people in the sector and take evidence, they will be able to report their own view on that. But actually quite an important document in actually taking the sector forward to agree a platform of activities.
I understand that, Mr Fleming, and I listened very carefully to the answer you gave to the convener. And I totally accept the way that the strategy has been developed. I fully understand that. What I'm asking about is any potential situation where there was a problem, where an issue arose over the fact that the strategy was not being delivered particularly effectively. It's that accountability that I'm interested in, given that some of the players who have developed the strategy may not actually be institutions over which the Scottish Government can have terribly much say.
I mean, in the end of the day, it will be, as we've published it, it will be for us to report on a regular basis, hopefully collectively with the sector, on taking that taking the sector forward. So for particular issues, we will report transparently through that, and they will be identifiable through that process. I think I don't know if that answers your question, Mr. Smith.
Just like the convener, I'm not sure I'm entirely persuaded.
Okay, sorry.
I think as we go through, we will return to these very subjects as we take more evidence. But can I bring in Mary Scanlon at this point?
Brief question, really. Now that we know that corporate plan will be delivered 12 months after the start date, I looked at the financial memorandum, and obviously there's quite significant details of costs there, and that I've no doubt has been achieved by talking to the two organisations. Can I just ask, is there sufficient baseline data? Have KPIs been agreed at this stage of the plan? And, did you find that you had absolutely clear information on the national outcomes, KPIs, as well as the cost savings, in order to bring forward the information in the financial memorandum?
In terms of the financial memorandum, we worked very closely with the organisations to develop the best available information we could to develop that. Like all information, it has a particular currency of its moment, and we've tried to respond to the uncertainties that some of that data has by using optimum bias to identify where there is greater certainty around data and less certainty around data. And that optimum bias is applied through the calculations there.
So when you say that you worked with the organisations to develop it, I would have thought there would be more developing of the KPIs, etc., on the part of the organisations. I mean, they are totally signed up to,
yes,
to this, and the cost savings will be achieved.
Yes.
The baseline data is there?
Yes, it is. We have. I mean, it's there. It's there. in the document there, and we believe it is robust and accurate.
Okay, in terms of KPIs then, I've been looking at the national outcomes. As an economist, they're slightly difficult to measure. The one that possibly comes closest would be we National Outcome 12. We value and enjoy our built-in national environment and protect and enhance it for future generations. What key performance indicators are being developed and are in place in order to bring a measurement to that?
The current indicator for that measure, from memory, is buildings at risk, which is an indicator of List A buildings assessed at being at risk. By risk, we mean that they have an uncertain future. That indicator is measured through the Scotland Performance website, and is within the national planning framework, and that is monitored on a 2-yearly basis, I think, from data which is collected by the Royal Commission, and that indicates, if you like, is a proxy measure for the condition of our historic environment.
Yeah. I can't understand that very well, buildings at risk, but how do you measure we value and enjoy? How do you measure our value and enjoyment of the built environment for future generations?
I mean, in there are kind of various measures around levels of participation in the historic environment that we can measure. So if you excuse me a second while I just go and get my some of my things there. There are measures there around visitor numbers that we can measure. There are recorded accesses to records. There are recorded school visits. There are members, indeed, of both the National Trust for Scotland and also Historic Scotland as measures of that. There are also other measures around particular events like Doors Open Day, for example, Scottish Archaeology Month, and indeed volunteers, as I mentioned before.
And you would expect all these measures to be enhanced as a result of the merger?
I mean, again, jumping back into the strategy, one of the things we're doing is trying to share that measurement across the sector, because some of the measurements there are very similar to the ones NTS would use about some of these issues, and we think that actually trying to bring that together and creating a common framework around the measurement means that we understand, I suppose, not just what individual organisations contribute to the historic environment, but what the collective benefit actually is more broadly as well.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Vera. One of the issues I've been looking at is the question of definition. Some of the terminology seems quite wide in terms of interpretation. One thing is the term, very simply, historic environment. If you look at the bill, there's actually no definition of it, and the policy memorandum is a wee bit abstract in that. Is that a problem?
We don't believe it is a problem. I mean, the historic environment is one of the issues we addressed as part of the strategy, and it is actually defined within this document, the historic environment strategy. And the reason it is an issue which the sector wrestles with, exactly what the historic environment is. And one of the issues we explored when we started discussions around the historic environment strategy, if you like, was actually, what is it? How do we define it? The definition you see there is a product of the sector coming together to agree a common definition, which actually seeks to give a focus to that, because at the moment different organisations in the past have identified it in different ways. And this is a common definition which it resonates for the whole of the individual organisations involved.
I mean, other terminologies, for example, collection. What is a collection? What is an object? Mm-hmm. Is there not a danger of overlapping with other organisations in terms of the collections?
Yeah.
If I might answer that one, I think you would. Yes, we would certainly recognise, and we've made explicit reference in the policy memorandum, that there are many organisations who hold collections that relate to the historic environment, and we very much value their place within the sort of overall framework in Scotland. And I think you would expect that they would often be, and there are existing overlaps between the two bodies and other collections in terms of the broad definitions of what they may collect. However, they will be a collecting policy for Historic Environment Scotland, which is much more about refining exactly what they would be collecting. And I know that, as Diana mentioned earlier, that there has already been discussions with, for example, the other national collections, and we're working with other bodies for example, National Records of Scotland. We're working very closely with them in the development of this to ensure that different collecting bodies have complementary, not overlapping roles. And I think it's important that to state that actually ministers are dedicated to the success of all the collecting bodies within the portfolio, and to have unhelpful overlaps would be very much detrimental.
I think it's very important that your intentions there, but are there any legal issues around this? I mean, are you going to encounter any legal problems in terms of not having clear definitions of any of these terminologies?
It's the government view is that there are no legal issues in terms of the definition, and it would be quite odd. There are many other terms in the bill which are also not defined, and you would find in other bills, for example, education wouldn't necessarily have a specific definition in a particular bill. And I think it's important that policy and practice over time is allowed to define how these terms are used, because we can't quite. So I think the example given earlier about electronic formatting collections is really important, because that's something that we would hope this legislation would exist for a long time, and that's something that couldn't have been envisaged if this was, say, 50 or 100-year-old legislation, and we wouldn't want to be unnecessarily restricting the collecting practices of the body in the future, where we can't envisage the circumstances that it may be facing. So we have to ensure that this bill is future-proof, to ensure that that body can flex and change to meet the demands of the day.
Thank you. Can I just take that one step further and seek some reassurance from you on the definition of historic environment, which Mr. Bibby started with? If there's not a clear understanding by all bodies about what exactly that term means, is there not a danger that organisations could effectively stray beyond what is their responsibility into other areas that other organisations work in? To put a common phrase on it, is there any danger of a turf war between the new body and other bodies if there's not a clear definition of historic environment?
I think, as both Diana and Jenny have alluded to, it's how the organisations work relative to other organisations is going to be the key there. I think the difficulty, if you have a tight definition, a very clearly defined, very specific definition of historic environment, is that there's agreement at the moment what the historic environment is, but that does change. 20 years ago, for example, everybody was interested in battlefields. If you'd actually taken a definition of what historic Scotland did as being the historic environment, that would not have included anything to do with battlefields. So by having a loose or flexible definition, or lack of a definition, you allow the possibility of reviewing whether or not there are certain aspects of what people are increasingly recognising as heritage, as historic environment, that have been ignored. You can work up proposals as to how that might be integrated with the generally accepted historic environment and move forward. If you put very, very rigid boundaries around what the body can do, you effectively fossilise things. You could end up in 50 years' time with everybody saying what's happened about the heritage of X area, which we don't at the moment regard as historic environment, and you'll say, well, we've done nothing about that because it's not in our remit. So it does change. 30 years ago, industrial archaeology, for example, wasn't really thought of as being heritage. It was just, now it's pretty much mainstream. There are major visitor centres, huge tourism around it, huge interest. So what is the historic environment does change in time. It is, I think, appropriate to leave it flexible, but there will be boundaries, because this is something which is going to be continually reviewed. So if the organisation does dive off down some strange alleyway, there is always a possibility of actually saying, are you sure this is the correct place to be prioritising the limited resources which are being made available to you?
I wasn't for a moment suggesting or trying to suggest that you should put rigid and inflexible boundaries around what you do. What I was suggesting was that there has to be a clear understanding of where those boundaries are. Is that the case?
I would say there's a clear understanding of where the boundaries are. That's set out in the definition which is in the strategy. But nonetheless, those boundaries are quite fuzzy. They include associations, they include what sites and monuments and buildings mean to people. Those meanings change. So around the core of the physical surviving remains of the past, there's a hugely important cloud of associated significances and meanings. Very difficult to actually legislate for significance, meanings and so forth directly. So you, in a sense, you concentrate on the work on what you can actually measure, you agree, as the core, the physical core of that historic environment, but you do it in a way you don't neglect the fact that actually why that historic environment matters to people is actually because of significances. It could be personal associations, historic associations, very individual things, very general things, so that you've got, as it were, it centres on what survives from the past. But actually why people value it and benefit from it is largely about what it means to them. And it's that what it means to them which is extremely difficult to capture in the sort of definition that would sit happily in a piece of legislation.
Okay, I'm sure, again, we will receive evidence in this area from other organisations, so I'm sure we'll be interested in how they view that particular point. Can I move on now, though, with Liam MacArthur?
Thank you, Convener. Before turning to the issue of charitable status, you will have heard the exchange earlier on with Ian Walford and Diana Murray about I suppose the calls in some sections for a more regionalised structure in the merged body. As I understand it, it's kind of the approach that has been taken south of the border subsequent to merger. I suppose it's an approach you see in SNH and other organisations north of the border. Is that something that's been given much thought to at the moment? Is there anything that you can say about what's envisaged in that regard?
I mean, those sort of matters we would see as being operational matters for the new board to consider, to be honest. We would want the body to operate efficiently, effectively, to have connections, geographical connections. To some extent, Historic Scotland has much of that structure in place in terms of the conservation depots that exist across the country and things like that. It has a heritage management team that has geographically specific people focusing on individual local authorities. And indeed, through the community planning partnership structures, that Historic Scotland are engaging and supporting community planning partnerships already within that process. I suppose we would kind of see the new body would need to take a look at that and actually agree how best to engage at a local level and to put in place that structure as appropriate.
That's helpful. I dare say I'll be following that up. Again, I mean, I think in relation to mergers, always the apprehension is that what looks kind of administratively efficient doesn't necessarily give the organisation the reach and the character into those places out with the centre. But in relation to the charitable status, again, you will have heard the discussions earlier on. I think both Ian and Diana gave us a fairly thorough going over in terms of the justification and the benefits from moving to charitable status. I'd be interested in your take on some of the concerns that have been raised about, I suppose, a kind of crowding out or a displacement effect where Historic Environment Scotland to move into that area where National Trust, university departments, etc., are currently seeking pretty vital funding to their operations, and whether or not what you have is less of a partnership but a dominant player around which everybody else is kind of forced to operate on their terms.
In a sense, this is the debate that sits for me in the strategy in terms of trying to make sure that it is about growing the cake, as Mr Walford referred to, about ensuring that, and ministers holding the body account to support the delivery of the strategy. It will be, ministers in terms of their role for the wider historic environment will not want kind of unintended consequences of bodies suffering as a result of an organisation that is, through its scale, is more successful or displaces money. That's not what this is about. We've spent a lot of time encouraging a different approach, a different level of engagement, to fostering partnership engagements, working with organisations at a community level, with community groups, and that's very much what we want this body to do, and that sits within the drafting of responsibilities of the bill, regardless of whether it gets to charitable status, because charitable status is something for the board to decide and for OSCA to approve once the board is established. What we've said is this body will work in partnership with organisations, and that's fundamental, and we would not expect it to be engaging disproportionately in that process.
That's an interesting perspective on it. Can you see a situation where the relative roles and the types and sources of funding are not necessarily going to be inappropriate to set it down in legislation or even in a more formalised sense, but that actually there would be a view taken on where those sources of funding are likely to come, not just for the merged body, but for the other players and the other partners in this sphere. I suppose to provide some reassurance that what you're not simply seeing is Peter being robbed to pay Paul.
I mean, if you look at the financial memorandum, most of the benefits that we've identified from charitable status relate to gift aid and through rates relief primarily in terms of that, and a small element of donations that sit there. And what we're not seeing is anticipating that suddenly there would be this great opportunity to actually secure money at the expense of other organisations. Because as we said, that will just destabilise the sector. It will not achieve a positive outcome, and it will become even harder for the organisation to work with partner organisations if they become vulnerable. So we would not see that as being an outcome. And indeed, ministers can use their more broader sponsorship powers, the powers of holding the body account, to ensure that that behaviour does not happen.
And is there anything, I mean, again, probably less for the bill and more for the strategy, but is there anything that provides a degree of comfort that what you're not going to see is lottery funding, I suppose, in particular, simply being used to displace funding that has traditionally come from central government?
I mean, at the moment, Historic Scotland and the Royal Commission can apply, and some example has got benefit of heritage lottery funds. So
it's additionality that's been key, and it actually underpinned the rationale for the lottery funding. I mean, is there anything, as I say, probably more for the strategy than the bill that kind of underpins that and would give some comfort, as I say, that you're not going to see it eroded?
Primarily through the sponsorship rule, we would not be seeking for the organisation to pursue those particular avenues. Where it's appropriate and where it enters into partnership with other organisations and funding is possible, that's fine. But we would not be seeking to compete there. And it would be through the sponsorship rule that we'd seek to hold that account, as well as through the discussions in the strategy to make sure that people are working collaboratively to get together on that. So, for example, the Heritage Tourism Group, which has been set up involving NTS, Historic House Association and Historic Scotland, are there to work together to grow the heritage tourism cake. That is their raison d'etre, and that's where they work together, not simply just to gain advantage of another player. They have to work together to grow that and collaborate around that. And those collaborations could be issues around ticketing, around different elements that are appropriate for those bodies. We don't want to necessarily specify what they are, because the organisations have to decide what they are. So those sorts of arrangements are the sort of issues we would want to be achieved through that strategy discussion.
Thank you. Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. Can I ask technically what the reasons are that it's necessary to dissolve RCAHMS by preliminary legislation, and why that approach has been taken?
Yes, the Royal Commission was set up by Royal Warrant originally in 1908, so it's a part of our cultural heritage in itself. The normal provision when a body such as that ceases to undertake its functions is that it simply ceases to exist. So once the new organisation is set up, it's had its 6 months, as it were, breaking in period for the board, and everyone is convinced that it is correct and the time has come to transfer the staff, the assets, responsibilities across to that new organisation. Then at that point, the Royal Commission on Ancient Historical Monuments would cease to have any purpose. Strangely enough, and we've looked into this, it doesn't require anything other than to say it's finished with its work. There isn't a process whereby Her Majesty has to issue a dissolving warrant. It's simply sufficient to say, as we provided in the bill, that at a particular date the provision will be commenced, that the Royal Commission will be dissolved. We had some very interesting discussions about the word dissolved. It seems a little bit disrespectful, but that is the word that is used in statute, so we had to stick with it. We were hoping for something a little bit more celebratory.
And a final question, if that's okay. Sorry.
Just to clarify this point. My understanding is, and I think you've just said this, is that there's no legal necessity to put the dissolution of RCAHMS in the bill. You can just say, we're finished.
That's correct. We could simply have let it
disappear. You put it in the bill?
Simply for the avoidance of doubt. Otherwise, people perhaps in 3 or 4 or 5 years' time would have said, oh, well, nobody ever told us it had stopped. Are they not still hiding out there doing some very, very small function, which we're not aware of? So it's just for absolute clarity to say that this is the point, this is the handover, everything is safe to go, and the commissioners can then, as it were, be stood down, hopefully with a degree of honour and celebration. But there's not actual, you're absolutely right, it is a belt and braces. We could simply have let the Commission die once all of its functions had gone without any mention. It seemed appropriate to mention it for the sake of clarity.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
No, thanks, Convener.
Listen, can I thank your team for coming along today. It's been very helpful. There's also a number of questions probably that we might follow up on, no doubt, through the process. And I know there are some issues you're going to get back to us on that you mentioned earlier. So again, once again, can I thank you for your evidence session today? Thank you for you and your team. Our next evidence session on the bill will likely be in May, but it will certainly be after Easter recess. And the reason for that is, of course, we want to wait till all of our consultation evidence has come in that we have asked for. And once all the written evidence is in, we will then once again pick up the bill at that point. I hope that this will be a useful session for members, because I think it was important that we got an early start to discuss it with the bill team and others today. So I think it has been very useful to do that. So thank you very much again for your help. And that concludes our meeting for today. I close the meeting. Thank you.